Sup you sinister folks. This is What If Deku's Cursed Blood Could You Know Reverse Death Part 11, Chapter 31, Sinister Special 2. Shoto Aizawa, the pro hero codenamed Eraserhead, was having a rather worse day than he'd expected to have. Not only had he been somehow saddled with being Hayashi's co-announcer for the sports festival, but he'd also had to deal with the machinations of the board's more amoral members right from the start. Case in point, he was just now taking a breather after the discovery that the tournament's randomization placement program had been tampered with. And he'd be shocked if it didn't turn out to be one of those meddlesome idiots who'd done it. And once the festival was over, the exhausted man just knew there was going to be terrible backlash when that particular tidbit came to light. At least they didn't fork with the first match, Aizawa groused absently to himself as he took a small detour to a vending machine he knew had been recently installed in a nearby hallway. He had time. Surely Hayashi was capable of opening the first match by himself, right? He needed the caffeine anyway. For whatever that small mercy's worth. Despite the other changes made to the tournament's lineup, his problem child, one Izuku Midoriya, would still be going first. Just mulling over all of the negativity the cinnamon roll of a kid had faced so far in his short life, for all the wrong reasons, was depressing. Honestly, the underground pro wasn't sure what would be worse for his student at this point, losing here at the first round, or advancing further. Is that my favorite Eraserhead I see? The cheery, sing-song voice froze the brooding homeroom teacher in his tracks, the pit of his stomach dropping out just as he was about to push the button on the vending machine for his beverage. God damn it. What a coincidence. Aizawa scowled, back still turned to the new arrival. If she made a point to say that right from the start, that meant only one thing. This wasn't a coincidence at all. Are you stalking me? The underground pro asked the intruder, refusing to turn around and face his fate. Why did it always have to be her, the one woman who would never respect his personal space? The one woman who'd never leave him alone? Don't you have students to keep track of? Joke? Ah, a co-worker of mine will take care of them, the pro-heroine codenamed Ms. Joke replied, joviality dropping for a moment as the seafoam-haired woman almost sounded human for a moment. Besides, they're probably at the stands getting junk food and drinks anyway. They don't need me for that. Aizawa grunted at the casual dismissal. He reached out to select his beverage, but paused when his bubbly torturer slid up beside him with a wide grin on her face. It took an ungodly amount of effort for the underground hero to keep from looking at that world-brightening smile. But, really, that's not important. Miss Joke continued, raising her hands up and interlacing her fingers in a faux prayer position. She gave the gruff homeroom teacher a look. This is. Meeting you like this, by complete chance, is clearly fate. Come on, what do you say? You and I shall? No. Aizawa snapped, cutting off the comedian before she could finish. He tried returning to the task at hand, of getting his beverage, damn it, but gods. Why did it still have to hurt so much? Even after all these years, why was it so hard to leave the past behind? Oh come on. Miss Joke playfully bemoaned, collapsing into Eraserhead's side. Even as he knew that this was just one of the woman's gags, from the corner of his eye Aizawa could have sworn he saw an honest, pleading glint in hers. At least let me finish the line. Aizawa grumbled in response, willing his focus away from the woman hanging onto him and back onto the vending machine. He just needed to finish what he was doing, before it was too late. Don't ignore me, Shoto, Emi Fukakado whispered, nearly begging. The seafoam-haired pro-heroine leaned into the gruff underground heroes, turning and burying her face into his side. Please, lightly trailing a gauntleted hand up Shoto's side, Emi realized where she was touching and, after a moment of thought, poked a specific spot on the exhausted man's ribs. More precisely, she poked where an old scar should have been, a tender reminder of their past together. For Aizawa, it was a button that instantly hurled him back through memories and nightmares better left buried and forgotten, in a flash. The underground pro was no longer in the sports festival stadium, but falling down a kaleidoscope-esque infinity of fragmented imagery, jumbled colors, and cacophonous sounds. Blinking furiously against the inevitable onslaught, Aizawa struggled to see through the phantasms, to move a single finger and push a button, any button, on the vending machine. But then the smells hit him. Flashback. Yasha unifayadus, ya hero scum. Everything had gone to shit so fast. Of course, it had to have happened eventually. Two young and brash bros, no matter that one tried to be more mature and keep the duo grounded, would have eventually bit off more than they could have chewed. The world was full of ugly places, and the greenhorns Eraserhead and Miss Joke had just invited themselves into one. It should have just been their first taste of taking down a pair of big fish. Instead, it had been a lesson in bad decisions, and the consequences they brought. Yay! Shouldn't you taken the civvies and run? Weta got away and everyone have been happy. The Blade Brothers, a pair of high-level villains who'd spent their time plying their talents on low-level targets like stand-alone jewelry stores and mom-and-pop businesses. The two men were the worst of the worst, yet somehow kept out of the notice of most pro-heroes in the areas they operated in. Enter Miss Joke, a rising star on the hero scene, and Eraserhead, her unknown counterpart who kept to the shadows of the underground. After a hard-fought year of trials and tribulations, the unlikely duo had slowly cleaned up the slums of their city, to the point that their agencies had considered reposting them elsewhere. And then the call had come in. The Blade Brothers had taken hostages in their most recent heist. Flashback out present, UA Sports Festival Stadium, interior hallway system. Emmy withdrew slightly, frowning as she realized Shoto hadn't made a grunt or rejected her since she'd prodded his old wound. Her dark, green eyes widened, the pro-heroine realizing too late that the gruff man was beginning to tremble, his own eyes staring forward yet unfocused. Oh no. Flashback. I think it's time you brats learned a lesson. They'd forked up. Turned out the brothers had, between them, basically been immune to their quirks. The elder, who'd squared off against Eraserhead, had been a mutant type with tusks of all things growing from his forearms. The ivory additions had been filed to a razor's edge, and said edges had been kept purposefully filthy to ensure any injuries they caused would not only be agonizing but quickly fester and worsen. The younger, who'd immediately faced off against Miss Joke, had extendable nails that were somehow long, jagged, and sharp all at the same time. For some reason, probably as a result of whatever had given him the large scar that wrapped around his head starting from his ear, across his forehead, to his other ear, the man couldn't laugh. It had been like that part of his brain just hadn't worked. In retrospect, if they'd only swapped opponents, the entire outcome might have been different. But they hadn't. Flashback out present, UA Sports Festival Stadium, interior hallway system. Emmy bit back a curse. This wasn't what she'd wanted. She'd just wanted some attention, even just a laugh. She'd long since accepted she'd probably never get the yes she'd been aching for, but damn it, she was an idiot. Flashback. It hadn't even really been a fight, more a beatdown with sharp edges. By the time the elder brother had been satisfied with tearing into Eraserhead, the underground hero had been on the cusp of bleeding out. Internally, the damage had been just as severe, as an entire rib had been carved out and taken as a trophy by the older villain. And Miss Joke. You're lucky I hear the sirens, you piece of shit. If we weren't in a hurry now, I'd let my lil bro take his time with your circus freak over there. He needs some stress relief. Well, seen him gut like official just have to do. Shoto. Flashback and present, UA Sports Festival Stadium, interior hallway system. Aizawa gasped, the phantoms of the past dissipating at last. Looking to his side, the underground pro noticed the worried gaze of his old partner. Ka-chink. The vending machine depositing its prize hardly penetrated either pro's awareness as the two continued to stare at each other. Eraser. I have to go, Aizawa blurted, interrupting Miss Joke while bending down to swipe the acquired beverage from the vending machine. He really did need to get out of there. Now. Let me repay you. Miss Joke stuttered out, suddenly panicking. It was a desperate shot, she knew that, but she had to try. We could go on at that, no. Aizawa barked, sharply cutting off the distraught heroine. Without another word, the erasure hero turned and fled, rounding a corner and making his escape. Walking as quickly as he could, the underground pro tried, and failed, to keep his thoughts away from all of the horrible things that had followed that failed mission. That tragedy. Him losing that rib had been nothing compared to what had happened to Emmy. To what could have been, when he'd woken up in that nameless hospital, he'd frantically demanded to know what had happened to his partner. Before he'd succumbed to his injuries, he'd seen her. And her insides that had painted the area around her. He'd been beside himself, worried out of his mind. He'd been able to keep from losing any co-worker, friend or not, since his days at but even their Emmy had been special. They'd kept it beyond low-key, but they'd been dating for just over a year at that point. When he'd finally bullied a nurse into giving him the answers he'd been looking for, he'd wished he hadn't. She hadn't said anything to him, but she'd been pregnant at the time. Aizawa had never known if she hadn't known herself, been afraid to tell him, or had just wanted to announce it in some bombastic way, befitting her hero persona, but in the end, it hadn't mattered. The baby hadn't survived. To make the nightmare worse, the injuries Emmy had suffered had been deep, and far-reaching. Half her cecum had been torn out, and her lower intestine had been shredded as if put through a blender. The worst was yet to come, however. The younger brother's jagged claws had penetrated so deeply, they had left her uterus in tatters. Any chance Emmy had had of becoming pregnant again had gone down to nearly zero. And even if she could have conceived again, her life would have then been put at constant risk for the entire pregnancy, all for a slim 5% chance of being able to carry to term. The two of them had been devastated. Emmy had cried and been a mess for months, straight through her entire recovery period. And he'd been a coward, too afraid to approach her and talk about their future together. At the time, the only thing he'd known to do was one thing. Hunt down the bastards that had taken their future from them. Aizawa stopped, realizing he'd been aimlessly marching through the halls of the stadium. He needed to get back to the box before Hisashi said or did something stupid. But he really needed a moment to rein in his emotions more. Once again, memories assaulted the underground pro. Having learned the extent of the brother's abilities, and no longer in the mood to play by the rules of law, it hadn't taken Aizawa long to catch the two villains. In fact, it had taken longer for him to leave them tied up hanging from a 5-story building. After beating them nearly to death, and breaking every bone of theirs he could. While he'd stopped short of killing the Blade brothers, it had still been an unsanctioned operation that had smacked of vengeance instead of justice. Aizawa had been faced with a mark against his license, and it would have been the end of his career, if Interpol hadn't stepped in. The international organization had spoken up on his behalf to the Hero Association, proposing he take time away from the Japanese hero scene while joining their own division of lawkeepers. The Jaggers. Aizawa took a sip of whatever beverage he'd ended up getting from the vending machine. Eck. Sweet. The gruff man normally avoided sweet things. They reminded him too much of the woman he'd just escaped, the one his own ineptitudes and hubris had left mutilated. That line of thinking led the underground pro to thoughts on another poor soul who'd suffered because of his failures, a certain nascent necromancer. If his Midraya weren't able to heal the most grievous of injuries like he could. The thought still gave the normally stoic man shivers. It was too bad his student's quirk couldn't heal older, more severe. Aizawa felt the breath leave his lungs as he touched his side, feeling for the missing rib that was his physical reminder of past failures. It wasn't there. Or more accurately, the rib was no longer missing, it was there. But the doctors had been clear, regrowing bones from nothing was next to impossible. Short of finding a person with a specific quirk that allowed for bone manipulation in others, nothing in the medical world's current arsenal could have repaired his injury. It had been a trait shared by Emmy's scarred uterus, something neither of them could ever recover. Suddenly, a drop of hope rippled through Shoto Aizawa's soul. If Izuku had somehow given him his rib back. Could he? Kodemis. Eraserhead. Do you copy? The sound of Nimari's voice coming through his communication bead, in full midnight persona, snapped Aizawa's, back to reality. Eraserhead here, the underground pro replied, internally compartmentalizing his last train of thought for later. He couldn't afford for the possibility of a ray of hope to mar his performance here. Did something happen? The gruff man called it a ray of hope, but if he were honest with himself, it now burned at his insides as if he were trying to hold the sun in his chest. Oh, nothing much. Midnight drawled, causing Eraserhead to frown. Just Mick calling your problem child a monster on air. Aizawa didn't bother to respond or ask for more information. Problem child or not, budding necromancer or not, Izuku Midoriya was still a hero in training and a student of his student. He knew Hisashi had his reasons for disliking those with so-called dark works, but that was, sure as hell, no excuse to go after kids. Magnus, and remember, if you want your own special chapter, either here or on Blessed with a Hero's Heart, you can visit our Patreon page to learn how to request it. Trying to make amends in the bowels of UA Sports Festival Stadium, inside one of the many rooms dedicated to allowing participants a space to rest and focus, a pair of longtime friends could be found sitting across from each other. Ijiro Kirishima and Mina Ashido had known each other for what seemed like forever, even before their quirks had come in, and in that expansive stretch of time, nothing had come between the two quite like this. In her chair, Mina sat silently, curled into herself as she pouted fiercely. The pink-hued girl was visibly trembling, and it was clear to anyone who knew her, like Ijiro did, that she was a hair's trigger away from lashing out. The redhead himself, though, was in no hurry to draw the ire of the girl across from him again. Already, he was sporting a swollen eye and glowing red handprints all along his face, chest, and arms. Instead, the manliest man of Class 1A held an expression of deep shame upon his face as he looked down at the floor. This was all his fault, Ijiro had concluded. Their fun had crossed the line because he'd been an idiot, and now Mina, his best and oldest friend, hated him. He'd spent the last who knew how long thinking about it, hard, but the hardening user couldn't come up with any way of making up for his mistake, for what he'd done to her. But he had to keep trying. He was a man, and a man didn't run away in a situation like this. Mina. Ijiro whispered, standing up and hesitantly shuffling closer to the pinkette. I'm so, don't. Mina bit out, interrupting the redhead mid-apology without even looking up at his face. Don't you dare say it. The manliest man of Class 1A grit his teeth against the groan that threatened to rise up from him, knowing that wouldn't solve anything. He also now knew that Mina was still in the midst of a moment of righteous feminine fury, and while he would never dream of begrudging the emotions she was feeling right now, he still had no clue on how to deal with them or help her. He'd given her the clothes that he'd left in his locker from before he'd changed into his uniform, which she was now wearing. He'd gone and bought her the brands of juice and sour snacks that she loved, which she'd grumpily drank and eaten. And as he could still feel and see on his skin, he'd even let her smack him around until she'd hopefully felt better. The only thing he apparently wasn't allowed to do, to his frustration, was actually apologize and say how sorry he was. Mina. Ijiro said again, more firmly this time but just as pleading. As understanding as he wanted to be, the redhead had just about reached his limit. He refused to lose his best friend over this. Not after everything they'd been through together. What can I do? I'll do anything at all. Please. Finally, Mina looked up and locked eyes with the remorseful and begging boy who'd shuffled so closely to her. Golden pools of black caught natural crimson, in fields of bloodshot white. No matter how closely he looked, Ijiro couldn't find the hidden mischief he'd always loved to see. Did you see them? The blurted question threw the redhead for a loop, but Mina's hard, unblinking gaze was proof enough she was being serious. Ijiro felt his mind stutter, freezing for what felt like an entire minute as his natural chivalrousness stalled his thoughts in understanding what he'd just been asked. With each passing second of silence, the hardening user could see his inability to answer was causing Mina to grow angrier and angrier. Then, finally, it dawned on him. He knew what this was about. His best friend was worried that he'd seen her naked upper body. Mina, no. Don't worry. Ijiro said quickly, nearly stumbling over himself. He scratched the back of his head, butterflies from his stomach causing him to feel nervous all of a sudden. I didn't see anything. I swear. Instead of the relief he'd expected to see, the manliest man of Class 1A saw Mina only pout harder than ever. The glare alone was enough to cause him to flinch back. But it was the truth. He hadn't seen anything. By the time he turned to see what the problem was, Mina had already covered herself with her arms and had started running out of the arena. Honestly, the redhead could, without a shadow of a doubt, say he hadn't seen Mina's naked chest since they were little kids playing around in the bath together. And everyone knew that that didn't count. Right? Suddenly, Mina jumped to her feet, nearly headbutting Ijiro before leaning into his personal space, eyes blazing. Everyone saw them. The pinkhead murmured, enraged, everyone. Except you. As if he hadn't been feeling bad enough. Now Ijiro realized just how badly he'd truly forked this whole thing up. It didn't matter if he hadn't seen anything. The sports festival was broadcast internationally. With one mistake, he'd basically forced his best friend to flash the whole world against her will. What a piece of shit he was. Ijiro trailed off, unable to continue. His heart was hurting worse now. It ached to fix this mess and make Mina feel better. But Mina once again interrupted the redhead. Then look at them now, Kiri. Closing her eyes in a fruitless attempt to lessen her embarrassment, the pink-hued girl lifted her borrowed shirt up as high as it would go. There. She'd done it. She'd finally given the boy in front of her a full, unimpeded view of her breasts. Was she still pissed that basically anyone with a TV had seen them first? Hell yeah, she was. Did that mean she didn't want the redhead she'd shared so much with to see the same, on her own terms, any less? Hell no. Mina expected a lot of things to come from her rash decision, shouting. Carrie stumbling back into a chair in shock. Maybe a little, grope if she were honest with herself. But silence. Oh fork. Did he not find her attractive? Had she worked up the nerve to do that for nothing? Thud. Snapping her eyes open at the loud noise, the slightly panicking pinkette was greeted with a humorous sight. Ijiro had fallen to the floor, unconscious, with a massive nosebleed. You idiot. Even as she crossly muttered the words, a gentle, loving smile softened Mina's face. She was going to make sure Kiri never forgot what happened between them today. By sundown the pinkette swore to herself she'd have finally caught this boy, the prey she'd been hunting since she was a little girl who'd become enamored with the loud little boy who hadn't cared about her freaky appearance when her quirk had come in. Tsaru wasn't the only one who'd be claiming a boyfriend this year. Not by a long shot. Chapter 32, Sinister Understanding. Shoto Todoroki, the son of Endeavor, knew beyond a shadow of a doubt he was in trouble. While the rest of the remaining competitors that were advancing to the next round of the festival's tournament had been guided to their own personal waiting rooms, he'd been singled out and taken to a different part of the stadium's labyrinthine sub-area. Now here he was, facing the principal of UA himself sitting in a large, imposing chair, flanked by members of the board at their own seated positions. For once, Todoroki understood exactly why the bastard always had his lawyers ready and on call. Todoroki-san. Nezu began, the quirked animal's voice, normally so amicable toward a student, now held an uncharacteristic seriousness to it. The tone alone caused the addressed student to shiver. I trust you realize the magnitude of your actions? Right off the bat, Todoroki realized he'd been asked a trap question. Years of watching the bastard's interviews came flooding back to the front of the heterochromatic's thoughts all at once. In all that time, that man had never once acknowledged the true gravity of his actions, most likely because doing so would have obviously placed his career at risk no matter how he'd respond. Answering affirmatively would have indicated malicious forethought, while denial assured a one-way ticket to a mental institution for a slew of evaluations and worse, a hold placed on his license. But, for all his bullshit, the bastard had at the very least conceded that his actions had consequences. I'm sorry, Todoroki replied, keeping his gaze firmly planted on his shoes while at the same time holding his voice firm and low. He would acknowledge the situation his actions had caused. I overreacted. I went too far when striking backhand. I apologize. The words hurt too much to continue, his tongue in searing agony as if doused in alcohol after being cut by razor blades. He had just... goddamn it. He just said the exact same words the bastard, his father, used whenever he found himself cornered by his actions. Verbatim. He swallowed hard, and the acid in his mouth sunk to bubble and roil in his stomach. This is a far more delicate situation than a simple apology can hope to cover, young man, a board member rumbled out with a heavy voice, the placard, declaring public relations the elderly man's only descriptive factor. Your actions nearly cost another student her life. And that's not even taking into account that your tantrum even struck 2 of our teaching staff as well. Todoroki had the decency to wince at that. When the security bots had grabbed him, their quirk suppressant clamps snapping into place around his biceps, he'd briefly been able to look around before they'd hauled him away and had seen for himself the unintended effects of his mistake. Samantha-sensei and Midnight-sensei, the 2 pro heroes in charge of keeping students from going too far. They'd both been partially frozen. And it had been all his fault. While we are thankful that Midnight and Samantha suffered no lasting wounds or otherwise hazardous effects to their health, the same cannot be said for your opponent, Kyaou Kajiro, a horned woman, whose placard read finances, continued. Had Izuku Midoriya and Fumikage Tokoyami not been there to act, it is doubtful even our illustrious recovery girl would have been able to prevent, at the very least, a loss of some degree to the girl's extremities. It might have been merely a few of her fingers, or as bad as an entire limb, but regardless the fact remains you attacked with your full force. Todoroki hunched forward, growing even further ashamed of himself as his mistake was read out plainly. The bastard had been in situations like this countless times before, each and every time escaping punishment by citing some contrived law or calling on his lawyers when that wasn't an option. At his worst, he'd even leaned into the supposed stupidity of any fool who dared oppose him while expecting not to get hurt for the insult. The heterochromatic boy knew he could have done the same here. He could have stood there and thrown all the blame on his classmate for being unprepared for his counterattack when she should have known of his power by now. He could have cited his earlier efforts in the battle trials, and the USJ, how he'd shown how outmatched she'd been were long before they'd ended up in the arena together. But he just couldn't. He wasn't him. He refused to act like him. I'm sorry, Todoroki repeated, unable to think of anything different to say. What else could he say? Once again, Midoriya had saved the day. Once again, he'd been left to play the fool. His pride was in tatters. He, the son of Endeavor, the pride of the number 2 hero. Titles he'd always loathed. What had he done since entering UA? He might have helped All Might himself get out of a tough spot during the USJ attack, but it had been Midoriya, a nobody with a dark quirk befitting a villain, who'd taken down a monster engineered to kill the number 1 hero. The very same monster the best of the best had struggled with, and after that, he, the strongest of Class 1A, had been sent to therapy while a renowned detective had selected Midoriya for special training. The necromancer had even interviewed with an agent of Interpol. When the bastard had gotten wind of that, he'd gone on and on about it. And now, he, the child born and bred for glory, had stood there like a villain while the nobody, the mutant, The monster had taken another bite of the glory of true heroism. Actually, if he'd overheard the board members correctly before he'd entered the room. Regardless of how sinister Midoriya's quirk was, the necromancer had once again used his blood, this time to heal their classmate of her injuries. Todoroki-san, as you've already been told, this situation isn't one you can apologize your way out of. Nezu spoke up again, two other board members sitting across from those who'd already spoken flinching as the quirked animal scowled. Under normal circumstances, this incident would have been sufficient to end your participation in the festival entirely. However, we find ourselves in abnormal circumstances. As he trailed off, Nezu full-on glared at various members of the board, even at the empty chair with the placard labeled security sitting forlornly in front of it. There was a moment of protracted silence as each victim of the principal's vicious stare cringed back as they were subjected to it. While Haruno's meddling had been disastrous in a nearly catastrophic way, others of the board hadn't had the presence of mind to not add fuel to the pyre when they discovered what she'd done. Indeed, Agent Smith, along with his own investigations, had uncovered that Endeavor had paid quite a hefty sum to various board members behind his back as well. The unscrupulous hero hadn't made any petitions too outrageous, on the surface, but the fact they'd been accepted at all made the quirked animal's blood boil. At least the discovery had uncovered the origin of the handicap placed on students who'd otherwise have been able to freely use their previously cleared support gear. Not to mention the source of their current conundrum as well. Fortunately, the principal of Anuhi still maintained the power of having the last word when it came to who attended his school. You are hereby presented with two options, Nezu declared, delivering the sentence with none of his usual amicability. The seriousness caused the heterochromatic teen before him to tense. You may choose to drop out of the tournament right now of your own volition while offering a public apology for your actions. It wouldn't free you of any of the legal repercussions of your accidental outburst, however. The Jiros would still be perfectly within their own rights to press charges, of course. Your actions far exceeded the limits of the waivers parents of our incoming students sign after all. The hairs on the back of Todoroki's neck stood on end. It would be a wise choice to take, even without hearing any other option. He'd be showing goodwill to the public, his humanity, not to mention solidifying to himself his intention of walking a path different from the bastards. It might even lessen the backlash amongst his classmates. But his pride demanded he face Midoriya. He would show the necromancer, and the world, that the power gifted to him by his mother was greater than that which the bastard had cursed him with. Your only other option is to continue after taking a verbal and written oath that no further mishaps will occur, Nezu continued, easily catching the hopeful glint in his troubled student's eye before the teen managed to control himself. The quirked animal was more than ready to brutally stab at that hope before it caught into something dangerous. However, know this, Todoroki-san. Should you fail to show restraint, should you grievously harm another student in a failure to exercise self-control, you will be expelled immediately. I trust there's no need to explain what that course of action would entail, do I? Of course there wasn't. In the recorded history of Japan since the establishment of and later other hero schools, had not an expelled student from the country's first institution for producing heroes for violent actions or injuring fellow students ever been accepted by the Hero Association as a pro-hero. It was just as bad, and permanent, as being officially blacklisted. Instead of waiting for him to make his choice, Todoroki was waved away by Nezu. As the heterochromatic teen left the room, presumably to be guided to his own waiting room, the unspoken had been made perfectly clear. He had until his next match to make his decision. UA Sports Festival Stadium, Contestant Arena. Nearly an hour had passed since the final battle of the first round of the third event and the remaining competitors had been led away. Thankfully for us, the public had mistaken the extended time required to settle its issues in private as the time required to repair the arena after all the damage it had suffered. That ignorance was a leading reason most every member of the audience in the stands were still in high spirits, why they were still so fired up for the next battles coming up. The battles that were going to have to start any minute now. For one Izuku Midoriya, this was just the next step in his day. The match he was about to begin would be much more difficult than need be thanks to the lack of ranged options on his side, but he'd deal with it as best he could. "Don't worry boss," Saki reassured as she flexed, pulling on the fabric of her red tracksuit with wide highlights so her noticeable arm musculature could be noticed. The blonde was more than ready for a fight. "This cunt doesn't stand a chance against the two of us." Dealing with the prospect of controlling Saki's lust for battle as well as an opponent coming for his head? That actually worried the Verdainat a little bit. For one Shiozaki, the pious teen with vines for hair was grateful to the lords for finally giving her the opportunity she'd long been waiting for. She was finally being allowed to confront the monster of UA face to face. "The time has finally come," Shiozaki murmured as she finished one last prayer, standing just out of sight within the exit tunnel to the arena. "Now we will meet in sanctioned combat and I'll finally be able to set you straight." The vine-haired teen had, since her last confrontation with the Verdainat, come to terms with a hard-to-swallow truth she'd struggled to accept. Izuku Midoriya was not, in fact, the devil. The Prince of Darkness would have never come to the aid of All Might, even if it had been to maintain his cover in the mortal world. He wouldn't have thrown himself in front of that judge, either, especially when his survival wasn't assured beforehand. Such a wicked being would have been unable to risk itself to help anyone period. Midoriya had shown himself more than willing to do so on far too many occasions to be ignored. Even so, Shiozaki found herself still unable to see the Verdainat as an agent of good. Therefore, after lengthy reflection and prayer, the answer had come to her, as to the true nature of the being who'd taken the name Midoriya. He was no demon-born evil, but instead, surely one of the fallen, an angel who'd been led into temptation and now, through a twist of fate, sought redemption. To be accepted back into heaven, to seek to return to the loving embrace of the Holy Father. It was a vision the pious teen would love to help realize. The problem was that, Midoriya's nature as a fallen angel kept raising its ugly head. The foul art of necromancy, a perversion of nature itself, probably felt like second nature to a member of the fallen. No wonder the Verdainat didn't see his sins as the true evil acts they were. But she was going to help him. She was going to make him understand that he needed to cease his current path if he ever hoped to reach salvation. That's why, before she'd left her waiting room, she'd doused her hair, every vine, in holy water. A subtle green light blinked on in both exit tunnels, and with calming breaths, both Izuku and Shiozaki began to walk toward the arena. Those sitting in the stands of the stadium grew quiet, the jumbotron screens having flickered from their running ads to images of UA emblem. It's that time, folks. The second round of the first-year sports festival tournament is here. Yeah. It was time. From the southwest gate, after making short work of her last opponent, the priestess of Class 1B herself returns to prove the strength of her faith. It's Shiozaki. The pious teen stepped into the light of the field and walked to the raised arena without so much as a single wave to the surrounding audience. Honestly, Shiozaki was of the opinion that this battle shouldn't have been made a public spectacle. The act of bringing one to salvation was not meant to be a means of entertainment. In fact, the vine-haired heroine in training decided then and there that she'd abandon this foolish competition once she'd completed her mission. And from the northeast gate, after utterly crushing the hopes and dreams of his opponent, ITZWHO roars in the face of impossible odds. Izuku Midoriya. The stands grew quiet. Many watching were attempting to figure out how things would go crazy this time. In the first match of the day, they'd witnessed one of the monster of UA abominations, the brain-dead one, in action. This time, the mutant had chosen to bring a different creation. And it was clear to all who watched that this one could think and act on its own. Izuku stepped up into the arena to a nearly silent stadium. Murmurs abound, but the Emerald Necromancer paid them no mind. His desire to receive a warm welcome and cheering had long since died, Instead, he'd take his glory from doing his job and saving people, damn the opinion of the uneducated and bigoted, to hell. And by his side, he's the Spitfire of Kyushu. She's the undead leader of her very OWN biker gang and a wild beauty that will literally bite OFF your, don't you dare. Saki Nikaido. The stadium might have been as silent as a grave at her introduction, but Saki could have sworn she heard her entire gang cheering her on from their beach, Reiko especially. That didn't stop the blonde from flipping the loudmouth pro, screaming his head off the bird. "Fork off, you pervy loudmouth, fork!" Saki screamed, raising her middle finger toward the announcer's booth. "Don't think that shitty glass box will keep you safe." Shiozaki sent a reprimanding glare at Izuku, but the unrepentant necromancer refused to even act apologetic. As a longtime viewer of UA sports festivals, the Verdane knew for a fact that President Mick had been rather aggressive this year. He deserved the flack. Midnight sighed from her position beside the arena. Of course she'd read the reports of the past interactions between these two students, and she had to say, she was rather wary of letting this match go. Had it been up to her, she'd have been hard-pressed not to just call off the entire thing right then. "All right, ladies and gentlemen, we're ready to begin the second round," Midnight declared, pushing as much false enthusiasm as she could into her words. She was still annoyed that she could imagine that most of the cheering she could hear was being given by those who wished to see a certain Verdane fall. "Now remember the rules, you two. And that you're both heroes in training. Begin." As Izuku had predicted, Shiozaki wasted no time in making the first move. It just wasn't exactly what he thought it'd be. "Izuku Midoriya!" The vine-haired teen shouted at the top of her lungs, stepping forward. "I apologize for calling you the devil, for decrying your actions as pure evil out of turn." While admittedly stunned that one of his more vocal and pious detractors was actually apologizing to him, Izuku had enough presence of mind to keep his attention focused on said opponent even as she loudly declared her regret with what sounded like heartfelt honesty. Fortunately for him, that meant he was able to catch the advancing vines that were even now extending out from the approaching girl and writhing their way toward him. Looks like guilty conscience or not, Shiozaki intended to fight with her all. "Saki," Izuku murmured discreetly, easily tapping the bond he shared with the blonde. "I gotcha, boss," Saki replied without looking away from her target, a savage grin spreading across her face. Shiozaki placed her hands together in typical prayer position, interlocking her fingers as she halved the distance that had originally separated her from her opponent. "But even so, there is still evil in you." The pious heroine in training continued, not breaking stride. "Today I will help you to start anew. Together we will purify first your body and then the bodies of those you've wronged and, before you a resident Christian could continue the declaration of her personal crusade, before she could switch to charging at the necromancer while her vine slithered behind him to box him in, she herself suffered the first attack of the match. "So what? You offering your withered forking rosebush to the boss?" The shout roared far louder from Saki's lips than Shiozaki could have ever hoped to match, easily overpowered the pious girl's words. "Sheet, even from here I can tell you're just a lost little virgin looking for the strongest dick to sit on." Saki continued, feral grin plain to see. "What a forking hypocrite. You know, I bet you're keeping your hands together like that cause you're afraid you'll start stripping right here in the open. You're so desperate for the boss's fork stick. Am I right?" Shiozaki dripped, her feet nearly stumbling over themselves and her tongue tied itself into knots at the unexpected assault. She sputtered loudly, her mind blanking at the sheer vulgarity thrown at it. Pure shock had frozen her stiff. Her entire life, Shiozaki had grown up valuing her chastity, taught from childhood it was a gift only to be given to her husband on her wedding night. She'd been raised sheltered, she knew that, shielded from all of the lascivious and sinful knowledge readily accessible in certain books and openly on the internet. And she knew that there would be those who didn't understand her morals and might even disagree with her stance on certain issues entirely. But this. In less than a minute, She'd basically been called a slut, a whore, and had had her purity not just questioned, but belittled. Worse, even now Shiozaki could feel the shameless words infecting her soul, corrupting that same purity. Sinful images of a large figure, silhouetted in deep shadow, standing over her imposingly fluttered through her mind's eye. Only the glare off a pair of glasses offered any insight as to the identity of the mysterious figure, revealing an orphan collar as a beastly huff resounding in her head. Shiozaki snapped out of the phantasm, but it was too late. Embarrassed and ashamed, the pious girl blushed hotly as she was forced to clench her thighs together as her hormones raged within her in sudden freedom. Shoo, shut up. You evil little. Shiozaki struggled to fight back, verbally or physically. Even thinking on what words would be adequate to hurl back at the blonde delinquent made her blush deepen. Finally, she settled on one. Pervert. Ha! Saki instantly shot back, exacerbating the situation. She was smelling blood in the water, but really, the uptight beach made it too easy. Don't give me that sheet. You know your mommy opened her forking legs to get you in and out, right? Are you gonna call her a pervert too? Unable to face the words being spewed at her, Shiozaki covered her ears and began to shake her head frantically. Had anyone been close enough to the panicking heroine in training, they'd have been able to hear her repeating some unintelligible mantra as if her life depended on it. Regardless, this gave Saki the opening she'd needed to cover the remaining distance between her and the vying beach on her terms. Why, don't we forking check and see if that pretty body of yours is as pure as you say it is? The blonde's words instantly broke through Shiozaki's hysteria. You know, I bet. You're already wet. Suddenly, thorny vines snapped up and wrapped around Saki's wrist, biting deep. The resulting struggle was ferocious enough that even those far away in the stands or watching from broadcasts were able to take notice. Undead muscles strained against the fortitude of nature. The epic battle was lessened only if one took notice of Shiozaki's face. The pious girl's face flushed red as she attempted to cover herself in obvious fright. Get away from me! Shiozaki screamed, truly and honestly fearing for her maidenhood. She couldn't allow this abomination to defile her. You freak, pervert, harl, urgh, wham. The vine-haired teen's frantic words were interrupted by a punch to the face, courtesy of Izuku. The Verdanet had used the distraction to maximum effect, keeping himself just outside of his opponent's range of vision and getting closer only when he was sure her attention had been entirely focused on Saki. Seeing Shiozaki ragdoll backward after his strike was a clear sign his plan had been a success. Oh man. That can't be legal, can it? Present Mick's sudden outburst resonated with the now wincing audience at large, many amongst the crowd seeing the match's development as having turned savage. The undead abomination's verbal assault on the heroine in training had been bad enough, but witnessing the monster of outright decked the poor girl in the face. It was horrible to watch. Never mind that only a match or two ago they'd been applauding such brutal tactics from other competitors. Forcefully keeping herself at her post, Midnight internally seethed as she nearly reached her boiling point. She loathed when people would pull out some kind of outdated code of chivalry from ages past only when it suited their tastes. Why hadn't they reacted like this during Ashido's match? Why had Jiro getting frozen solid not resulted in them calling for Todoroki to receive some sort of punishment? It was infuriating. Hadn't countless generations of women given their blood, sweat, and tears, literally in many cases, to be considered true equals in all levels of society? In the age since quirks began to manifest and villains had begun to appear, hadn't heroines risen up to fight for what was right just as heroes had? Were these idiots going to just forget that all but the rarest of villains gave absolutely fork all if their victims were women? Were they going to ignore the statistics of what happened to heroines caught unaware or defeated by said villains? Midnight wouldn't let them. She refused to allow any backsliding to happen if she could help it. As much as she hated doing them, maybe she'd have to accept one of those talk show interviews again soon. Psychological warfare, misdirection, intimidation, outmaneuvering your opponent. These are all valid tactics accepted and approved by every variation of the hero's code the world over. Shiizaki's quirk gives her the potential to physically defeat and restrain multiple targets at once with ease. In the face of that, Midoriya is using every tool at his disposal to even the odds. If his inability to fit into your ideal visions of the gallant hero offends you, feel free to reprimand him when returns from a hostage situation with your still-breathing children in hand. Eraserhead's stark delivery was like a slap in the face for many of the festival's watchers. Most of the civilians cringed as they realized they were being chastised for how easy it was for them to criticize heroes for how they looked or acted while ignoring their actual deeds. For the pros, the words were like a punch in the gut. Far too many of them could recall failed missions where they'd insisted on being flashy or honorable instead of getting the job done. Back in the arena, Izuku had accepted that Shiizaki wasn't going to forfeit, or pass out, from his punch or her hyperventilation. The vine-haired teen seemed stronger now than she had during the Class 1B test, which meant he'd have to hit her harder, faster, before she decided to make proper use of her quirk. The Verdanette nodded silently to Saki to prepare for what came next. In the time it took to do so, Shiizaki scrambled to her feet, just catching the exchange between necromancer and defiled corpse. Enough. Shiizaki's scream was accompanied by her hair coming alive like a hydra, erupting from her scalp and splitting into uncountable strands of thorny vines. The writhing plant life lashed about wildly, seeming to both protect its mother source as well as attack the approaching invaders. Despite their best efforts, Izuku and Saki were unable to avoid being caught. "Hey!" Izuku shouted as he struggled against the vines constricting him, flinching as their thorns began to dig into his skin. "Moderation please. Didn't Vlad-sensei teach you moderation? Goddamn forking cunt." Saki screamed, utterly enraged as multiple vines manhandled her like a doll. The blonde might not have been able to feel pain, but she sure as hell noticed that the accompanying thorns were hurting her boss. "I'm going to shove all these forking weeds right up your..." Silence. The screaming contest between Shiizaki and her delinquent adversary ended with a particularly thorny vine gagging the rebellious walking corpse. The pious teen had had enough. Her pride had been wounded, her mind had been corrupted, and even her body had been set upon now. This couldn't be allowed to stand. "Oi!" Izuku shouted, seeing blood spill out from around the vine-gagging Saki and realizing that Shiizaki had lost herself to her rage. "Why are you so angry? A win's a win, but don't, no. I refuse to listen to you anymore." Shiizaki interrupted, still screaming furiously. "Now you're going to listen to me." That actually gave Izuku pause. Not enough to really stop struggling to get free, but it did make him freeze for a second. Women could be scary. And now the thorns were really digging into him and drawing blood. Ouch. "I know you desire redemption, Midoriya-san," Shiizaki growled, calming only slightly as she turned to face the trapped Verdanette. "But you need to release this foul necromancy you've conjured. Regardless of your intentions, it's an act of perversion against nature, and I can see you're trying to be good. Oh my folks. It's another turn. Here I thought you a resident necromancer had proved himself nigh unstoppable." If he could have spared a moment, Izuku would have snorted derisively at President Mick's comment. He'd never seen himself as unstoppable. In all honesty, he'd always considered himself more on the frail side. If it wasn't for his regeneration, he knew he'd be a complete mess by now, if not straight up dead. He'd also never seen himself actually winning the sports festival. No matter how he looked at it, without his gear, he'd always thought most other students would have had a better chance than him, especially in combat. There's no such thing as an unstoppable hero, or villain. Strengths and weaknesses are what we all exploit in order to ensure victory in battle. Although it is true that sometimes the odds can be stacked against us too heavily to surmount, we're only human after all. That's why there are hero schools in the first place. We're here to teach our students how to scale those mountains. As the vines grew tighter, Izuku accepted that he was probably going to lose this match, and honestly he didn't mind losing to the religious Class 1B member. He hadn't capitalized properly on his advantages, and she had. Defeat in those circumstances was nothing to be ashamed of. But the way she was talking. Foul necromancy? Even after all this time, his girls were still not seen as people. It made his blood boil. Who were these assholes to deny them agency, to ignore the fact they could think for themselves and had their own feelings and goals? How could they act like that and still call him the monster? Izuku's heartbeat quickened, then deadened. What is thy desire? I understand, truly I do. Shiozaki continued, calming the longer she spoke. Unfortunately, as the heroine in training's rage bled away, it was replaced by the tinge of unhinged fervor. You want so badly to be a hero, but temptation is everywhere. You want to do good, but your nature is fighting you every step of the way. That's why you need to release the dead you've enslaved. Let me help you. Suddenly, Saki's neck made a sickening popping sound as a vine wrapped around it and squeezed, the delinquent instantly going slack. The vines around the blonde tightened further, clearly intent on carrying out the pious teen's mission. Izuku tensed. He needed to stop Shiozaki. Now. He had to. Then. Do. So. I'll start by putting this soul to rest for you. You've obviously grown too attached. Shiozaki shouted, turning her full attention to Saki's limp form. The heroine in training raised her hands, ready to utterly destroy the tainted corpse that shackled the vulgar blonde's poor soul to the mortal plane. Too late, Midnight realized just how serious the vine-haired teen was in ending the crimes against nature as she saw the zombie girls. Shiozaki. If you go any further. Then, they heard it. Midnight's words died in her throat as she felt something she'd only felt once before. Years ago, after she tried to console Shoto-kun after what had happened to him and Emi-chan. It wasn't a paralyzing aura of fear. It wasn't even a crushing weight of killing intent. If she'd had to name it, the pro-heroine would have simply said. It felt like death. Stop. A single word. That was all. A single word, not even screamed or spoken in a raised tone. That was all Midoriya said. Some undeniable force caused Shiozaki to turn back to her opponent, to obey that command. The sight that greeted her froze her stiff, every instinct shrieking in a million different directions. Midoriya. It wasn't the Verdanat that stared back at her. A blazing crimson stare met her head-on, held on a face that was, much to the pious teen's confusion, devoid of anger. Before her very eyes, Shiozaki watched as the vines she'd had restraining the necromancer suddenly withered and died. Now free, the Verdanat then began to approach. Stay where you are. Shiozaki stammered out, reflexively attempting to regain control of the situation. She sent more vines out to recapture her opponent, having belatedly realized he was the greater source of danger present. Unfortunately for her, the result was the same. Every single vine withered and died as soon as it touched Midoriya. The dark creature continued, its advance unhindered. You will not harm her, Izuku stated, unstoppable. I will not allow it. Feeling her fervor cool in the face of this thing coming toward her, Shiozaki threw all of her remaining vines at it, even dropping the defiled corpse she'd been about to purify to do so. Their fate was the same as all the others, turning to dust the moment they came into contact with the approaching Verdanat with glowing eyes. Impossible. Shiozaki mumbled, stepping back as she failed to comprehend how this was happening. I doused my hair in holy water. Nothing infernal should be able. That's when it hit her. The truth. All this time, Shiozaki hadn't been facing a necromancer, or a demon, or even a fallen angel. Any one of those beings would have been held back by her prayers, affected by her holy water, or succumbed to the sanctity of her crusade. No spawn of hell, servant of darkness, or lost spirit would have been able to stand against her and her ironclad faith. For Midoriya to still be unaffected by all of that, nay even offended at having it used against him, could only mean one thing. As these thoughts raced through the vine-haired teen's mind, Izuku had reached his opponent, without further issue. Despite being fairly close in height, the pious teen felt as if she were in the presence of a titan looking down at her. It was clear to Shiozaki now. Izuku Midoriya hadn't been affected by any of her divine interventions for one simple reason, and it had to be that reason because any other scenario was simply impossible or absurd at this point. How could she have missed it? Izuku Midoriya was an angel, a member of the heavenly host itself. That meant that she'd been toiling against an envoy of God himself, impeding the work of his will. This was an even bigger failure on her part than her performance during the faux villain test all those weeks ago. Shiozaki tried to apologize for her sin, the revelation nearly frying her brain, but unfortunately for her, Midoriya was in no mood to listen. The verdant archangel, blood boiling and heart drumming a war hymn, reared back and punched the repentant girl before him straight in the gut. UGH. Shiozaki choked on her own breath as the force of the strike lifted her body off the ground and forced all the air out of her lungs. The world slowed, the pious girl feeling herself remain airborne much longer than possible, as another revelation was visited upon her and her mind clicked more pieces into place. Those girls she'd seen as affronts to nature, they weren't mere undead, enslaved by the darkest magics and bound to a master. Hark, they were vengeful spirits, souls wronged in life and unable to find the justice they deserved before their deaths. But such phantoms were dangerous and needed something extremely powerful to both guide and control them. No mere cherub or angel would have measured up to the task. Which meant Midoriya wasn't just any angel. Even as pained as she was, Shiozaki gasped against the knowledge she'd just discovered. Midoriya was the angel of death. Good night, beach. Turns out, a broken neck did nothing to stop a zombie girl. Still mid-flight, Saki captured Shiozaki in a tight embrace from behind. With her momentum already having guided her body upward, the blonde had little trouble transitioning the airborne grapple into a perfectly applied suplex as the two descended. The vine-haired heroine in training was slammed back and headfirst into the hard concrete of the arena, cracking the floor tiles. She did not move afterward. And the winner is. Midnight started forward, being careful to keep a side eye on Midoriya as she passed the verde net. Noticing glistening emerald orbs gazing back at her questioningly, the 18+ only heroine continued, Midoriya by knockout. Not a soul in the stadium cheered, the audience too distraught by what they'd just witnessed. What the heck just happened? President Mick cutting off his usual screaming halfway through his own question was indicative of exactly how unsure those watching from the stands felt about what had just occurred. They'd just had front row seats to a clear win by the emitter-type Shiozaki fall apart in seconds as the mutant-type Midoriya had torn through her quirk before striking her down when she'd been defenseless before him. The blonde pro himself was more confused because he'd looked away for a second to chug a can of tea when he'd been sure Shiozaki was going to win. What? He needed to soothe his vocal cords every once in a while due to his quirk. I didn't look away but I'm still not exactly sure. Hearing his own stalwart homeroom teacher hesitate like that sent Izuku into a panic. Everything had moved too fast there at the end for him to understand what was going on. Had something happened? Before her boss could get himself in a tizzy, Saki came up and placed a supportive hand on the verde net's shoulder in a clear sign of support. Suddenly the jumbo screens above the stadium flickered on and replayed the final moments of the match. Camera angles zoomed in on Izuku cut back to back and Izuku finally noticed what had gotten the public in such a state. The larger-than-life display first played at normal speed, failing to catch how Izuku had sent Shiozaki flying. One frame he was staring her down with glowing crimson eyes, the next she was airborne and his eyes were green once more. Then, thankfully, a second playthrough began, running in slow motion. This time the verde net's movement was visible as a blurred motion. Ah, there it is. He just punched her. How the hell is that just a punch? Tuning out the now arguing pros up top, Izuku turned to Midnight for further instruction, just in case. The necromancer's concerns were for naught however, as the pro-heroine merely motioned for him to return to his waiting room with a gentle look. With a thankful nod, he headed off to do just that. Fist bumping as they left the arena, Izuku and Saki hurried away. If the two walked a bit faster than needed to escape the scrutinizing gaze and suspicious mutterings of the public, well, that was no one's concern but theirs. That didn't keep those watching from the stands, both pros and civilians alike, from mulling over what they'd just seen for themselves. Around the world, viewers who'd tuned into the esports festival were discussing the upset. Nothing clicked with what they knew to be true, nothing fit. Nothing they'd see so far would have led them to ever imagine what had just happened to be possible. A general sense of confusion began to spread. How did a mutant type, and a dark one at that, manage to pull off a move that was more than worthy of an emitter type? How had a dark quirk user like that even managed to enter such a prestigious hero school like What was Yua doing to keep such a concerning student in check? And most importantly, was Izuku Midoriya really a mutant type at all? From his place in the stands, the flame hero Endeavor grinned like a madman. His suspicions had been correct. Cursed blood offered enhancements to the user's body far beyond what mere physical exercise and training could achieve. And under his direction, a tool wielding such a quirk combined with that of his own creation would have infinite potential. Not even the most inhuman of legends would be able to stand against such a force. It was time he took what he deserved. His legacy would prevail. Aichi Prefecture, the Asui household. Inkanko. How did your son pull off that move? Buru Asui asked her much younger-looking friend, stumped at what they'd just seen on the television. Enhanced speed and strength aren't part of his quirk profile, are they? Karo. The Asui matriarch was worried, and with good reason. This was going to cause the younger Midoriya problems on both sides of the spectrum. On one hand, she had no doubt that quirkists would have a field day demonizing her soon-to-be son-in-law for the new abilities the world had just witnessed. Far too many of those bigots would see him as either a threat to their worldview, or themselves, or both. On the other hand, she could already hear the quirk breeders coming out of the woodwork to get their hands on cursed blood to enhance the quirks of their own families. I don't know. Inko murmured, holding her chin while in deep thought. It was incredible to see that the youthful-looking mother was already able to completely ignore the tadpoles climbing all over her, gushing about how amazing and cool their sister's boyfriend, their new big brother, was. I just hope he isn't starving right now. Buru nearly face-vaulted. Unfortunately, she also knew that the concern was a legitimate one. Izuku, for all his amazing and seemingly otherworldly powers, was incredibly dependent on the nutrients stored within his own body. After witnessing his sudden increase in speed and strength, there was no doubt in the frog woman's mind that there would surely be a high price to pay for it. A little apart from the two women and children, one Ganma Asui was making the first of his own moves. I know, but I want you to keep a closer eye on the kid. I haven't trusted that school security since they switched to mainly robotic enforcement, Ganma whispered into his cell phone. A webbed hand came up and dragged down his face in exasperation. Consider it a favor then. I'll pay for drinks after this. Oh fine, and it can be an extra big bowl of ramen too. Yes, with extra fish. UA Sports Festival Stadium, waiting room number 1. The waiting rooms in the sports stadium were meant to be sanctuaries for competitors to hole up in prior to their matches so that they could focus on the fight ahead, but those same students could make use of them afterward as well if they needed to. For a certain young necromancer, this was a much appreciated blessing. His last match had shown him something he'd only ever dared dream about before, knowing full well it was likely, far beyond the realm of true possibility. But now he wasn't so sure anymore. Did he have the power to actually fight for himself? The mental tribulation the Verdanet was currently experiencing seemed like it was more than enough justification for him to seclude himself for a short while. He needed to regain his focus, and quick. if he wanted a chance at understanding his new capabilities, before his next match. And, well, his classmates didn't need to see the depths of his voracious appetite. Izuku was scarfing down anything and everything edible that was placed before him. His own personal little angel and saint, Lily and Tay, were waiting on him, their arms full of whatever they'd managed to raid from the nearest vending machines. If the duo had been allowed to leave the hallway, they'd have hit the food stands outside the stadium as well, but the Verdinat knew they'd done their best. He was beyond grateful for their thoughtfulness. Izuna needs to eat, Izuna needs to grow, Lily sang happily as she passed more chocolate and bread to her big brother to messily devour. Lily knows Izuna will be the champion yo. The littlest zombie's cheering was followed and, accompanied by encouraging grunts from Tay. Saki was absent, but the rebellious blonde, somewhat skilled in skulking around unnoticed, had been sent to check in on Tsu-chan, and maybe bring back more snacks. Her mission helped Izuku's nerves in more ways than one, as the delinquent hadn't been able to shut up about how badass her boss had looked laying into Shiozaki, or how he'd soon be having a lot of. Well, she hadn't said girls, but Izuku understood her vulgar word choice easily enough. Throwing themselves at him. "Thanks Lily," Izuku said, chewing on the last snack he'd been given, a stick of dango. "I guess all we can do is wait now. I don't know who our next opponent will be yet, but between Tetsu-san and Ashido-san, either one will be a difficult challenge." The two zombie girls, present, nodded solemnly in understanding. Whatever the future threw at them, they knew they'd face it all together as a family. Ca-click-click. Ca-click-click. The door to the waiting room shook as its doorknob was throttled, but it stood fast and refused to open. Izuku tensed, but not by much. He'd locked that door himself. He knew whoever it was wasn't Saki. He'd have been able to feel the blondes arrive long before she'd reached the door, and it wasn't like the would-be intruder would be able to enter and bother him any. HSSSSS. The doorknob suddenly turned a glowing red. Seconds later, it melted clean off the door and dropped into a puddle on the ground. Well, that narrowed down who was trying to get in at least. But why would Todoroki go to such trouble? As the door swung open, the blazing form of Japan's second greatest pro hero, Endeavor, was revealed. Okay, so it was the worst Todoroki. Sheet. "Sir," Izuku said immediately, doing his best to remain calm while also heading off what was sure to be a stressful conversation one way or another, "I'm pretty sure you shouldn't be here. Please leave before this causes both of us trouble." It was an entirely justified response. All it would take was a single complaint from Izuku about this, and his dual-colored classmate would be penalized, if not outright disqualified. Interference of any sort against festival competitors, like say one's father speaking to a possible future opponent, could easily be taken as an act of sabotage. Unfortunately for the Verdinat, the flame hero didn't seem to care about this fact. "Quit, you're a yapping boy," Endeavor groused sternly, glaring as he entered the waiting room without waiting, or asking, for permission. The large man kicked out one of the chairs opposite his target and sat himself down, completely ignoring the warning growls from the two undead across from him. "I will have words with you." Izuku found that he really didn't like the tone that the number 2 hero used, much less what it implied. UA Sports Festival Stadium, Contestant Arena. Just look at her go, folks. UA Pink Daredevil is darting around her prey like a vicious hummingbird. Can Tetsu Metal keep him going? Can his metal win the day? Mina was having a blast. Long gone was any anxiety she'd felt about her little wardrobe malfunction. Gone too was any lingering insecurities she'd had about herself and her best friend. Now she was filled with a sense of fulfillment and determination. Splash! Twisting into a corkscrew midair, Mina avoided another hammer strike from the boy who many said was identical to Jiro Kirishima. As a parting gift, the pinkette slung a gout of acid as her hands curved around her, the liquid splashing against her opponent's metal forearm. It was so freeing, finally getting rid of that ugly feeling of jealousy she'd been unable to shake off ever since Tsu had declared, and confirmed, she'd landed herself a boyfriend. Mina knew it was no small matter for the mutant girl, she would know, and even if the conditions surrounding said achievement weren't the best, it still put her far ahead of their peers. Boom. Another failure by the metal man, of Class 1B, this time a stomp. The brutal move produced a lot of debris, but it hadn't even come close to landing on the horned girl, who'd already flipped out of the way with a cartwheel. The crowd was going wild, cheering loudly as the match continued. Many were calling her name, shouting out how good she looked, but Mina's large smile had nothing to do with such gregarious support. In fact, it was her trophy, her badge of success, that was making her grin so widely. With her shirt, and her sports bra, accidentally destroyed by her own acid, Mina had thought that she'd be out of luck, and had been steeling herself for having to withdraw from the tournament, finding a replacement that would fit her. Generous assets would have been a hassle, and she couldn't ask any of the other girls to borrow their outfits in case she melted through them again. That's when her newly minted boyfriend had come to her rescue. Carrie had almost flown out of his gym shirt he'd been wearing. He'd wanted to give it to her so fast. She'd been struck by a giggle fit at the sight, which had turned into honest laughter when she'd pointed out the garment was almost as much of a mess as her own had been at that point. The lovable doof had blushed as red as his hair, and then given her the real treasure. How he'd gotten it so quickly was still a mystery to her, but Carrie had given her one of his casual shirts, actually the one she knew he'd been wearing before changing into his gym uniform for the festival. The garment had smelled like him, of course. No doubt he'd spent hours working out in it, every fiber becoming infused with his potent sweat. Oh, the aroma of moss and sawdust. Mina would never tell a soul that she'd secreted something else besides her acid when she'd first put it on and taken a deep whiff. She'd basked in happiness until the very moment her name had been called for her next match. Don't mistake this match as being a carbon copy of Ashido's last. It's obvious she's learned from her previous mistakes. She's keeping her normally highly erratic style more measured this time, making sure to prevent a repeat of what happened before. If she can keep these more controlled, energetic moves going, well, that's a question we'll just have to wait and see the answer to. Why did Aizawa-sensei have to be so right all the time? Mina could tell she was flagging, her moves slowing bit by bit. The sharp smell of her own sweat, mixed with that earthiness of Kiri's, was giving her spurts of vigor whenever she could catch a sniff. Even so, the Pinkette wasn't sure if she'd be able to keep this kind of energy going into another match. But she did know that as long as she kept moving right now, she'd sure as hell have a good chance of winning here. Gam. Dropping into a short flare to avoid a punch at Tetsu stumbled back to avoid her swinging legs in turn, allowing Mina to pop up in a spin and sling another glob of acid directly on the metal teen's chest. To no one's surprise this time, the horn girl squircade through the last threads, keeping his shirt on, and the garment fell apart immediately. For a single second, Mina found herself distracted. Now, the Pinkette would openly admit that, prior to an hour ago, she'd been a huge believer in the idea that people should be able to appreciate the bodies of others. But now, seeing another boy's bare torso after feeling up Kiri's, it just wasn't the same. Almost subconsciously, she began to compare her opponent to her boyfriend, and she found Tetsu to be much less interesting. Kiri's angular musculature looked much more delicious than a carbon copy's more rounded edges. Not to mention, such wayward thinking cost the Pinkette dearly. Whoa. All it took was stepping back on a loose bit of debris that her opponent had created earlier when he'd missed an overpowered strike. The half-second it took for Mina to regain her footing was more than enough for Tetsu to launch a long-overdue counter. Grah! The steely teen's roar caught Mina by surprise. Refocusing on the fight, she was just in time to see a massive piece of concrete being tossed her way. Kaya! Mina couldn't contain her yelp as she stumbled away as quickly as she could, no fancy dance moves coming to mind in her panic. Watching the projectile sail by her, The pink cat counted her lucky stars. She was so nimble. Getting hit by that would have been the end of her. It was time to get serious. Turning back to glare at her opponent, seriously, who threw rocks in a fight? Mina came face to face with an angry cannonball. Wham! The collision caused a worldwide flinch. The metal man of Class 1B had successfully landed a tackle on the pink-haired daredevil of Class 1A after being picked apart for the better part of 15 minutes. Too bad that wasn't the end of it. Crunch. Gah! Mina screamed in complete and utter agony, the public at large cringing in sympathetic pain. Tetsu had gone full out, using all of his metal-backed strength, and the pink cat hadn't been able to position herself in time before their collision so that the resulting fall wouldn't hurt her. As a result, when the steel teen had put his full weight into the tackle and she'd fallen under him, Mina's shoulder had dislocated. As if in a frenzy, Tetsu hadn't stopped there. Remembering his lesson from Class 1B's villain test, to never give the enemy a chance, the steel teen proceeded to put his opponent into a submission hold. The move further twisted the horned girl's injured arm. The tortured shriek that ripped from Mina's lips. Tetsu was instantly sent back to that nightmarish moment when his stupidity had seriously hurt someone he hadn't even realized was precious to him. Snapping out of his war trance, Tetsu frantically scrambled back from the screaming pink cat under him. Jumping to his feet, the manly man of Class 1B worriedly looked up to the stands where he knew his classmates were seated. There, cheering along with the rest of their friends while pumping her fist in the air in a clear sign of support, was the one person he wanted to see right at that moment. Just seeing her okay made him feel better. Pony stared back, seeming to catch his eye. The blonde exchange student began waving her hands enthusiastically, clearly supporting a drive for victory. Tetsu nodded and turned back to his opponent. To see Midnight had come onto the arena and was checking the downed pink cat. Competitor Tetsu, Midnight said, holding up a hand, please remain where you are for a moment. The R-rated heroine had given the order because she needed a second. Even as a combat simulation, where injuries were expected, seeing a student wail in such pain was still a harrowing sight to see. To make matters worse, she'd experienced this type of injury before, so the Ravnet knew that what happened next could go either way. Checking over her downed student as gently as she could, the pro-heroine nodded to herself. Thankfully there weren't any broken bones. UA preached going beyond, but fighting with broken bones on top of dislocated joints was a quick way to retirement, or lost dreams. Now, to test the resolve of this girl, competitor Ashido, Midnight called out, keeping up an indifferent and impartial mask to cover her actual worry for the pink cat. Can you continue? Mina didn't couldn't immediately reply. The pain was too great. Instead, the horned teen curled into a ball while taking hold of her limp arm. She didn't want to give up. She wanted to show everyone that she was a winner, someone capable of being a heroine. Even if Midoriya just pushed her right out of bounds at the start of their match. She wanted to win. I can. Mina grit out weakly, pushing herself up into a kneeling position. Her grip on her limp arm tightened fiercely. She knew what she had to do. She'd even seen Midoriya do it a couple of times now. There'd been a heroic session once, earlier in the year, where the Verdanet had dislocated his shoulder after a spar had gone a little too far. He'd done the same in the middle of a battle trial soon after. Each time the freckled teen had made it look so easy to fix, simply yank the limb back, into place, give a cute little ouch, and carry on as if nothing had happened. I can do it. Mina roared as she did exactly as she'd seen, and yanked on her limp arm as hard as she could. Crunch. Gah. This time, when the pink cat shrieked in pain, there were tears. There were also winces from the audience, and gasps of horror at the sight. It was easy for the civilians to forget in their gorked society just how fragile the human body actually was, and how painful injuries still were. The pros watching, however, merely gave commiserating nods, well acquainted with such pain and injuries. It was a daily hazard of their careers, and they just inducted a new member into the club. Well, folks. Has the daredevilish hummingbird lost a wing? What will that mean for her? Can she stand, or is this the end of her flight? Can you do it, Ashido-san? Midnight asked, this time foregoing her mic. The Ravnet forced her voice to keep itself cold. Students needed to realize that in school combat, just like in the real world, there was no room for emotional distractions. Can you stand? Injuries, pain, fatigue. These are the conditions that we, as pro-heroes, will always need to overcome out in the field. One of the most important skills we hone is a student's sense of their own limitations. Heroes must know their limits, realize how much pain they can tolerate when carrying out a mission, understand which injuries can be ignored for the sake of saving lives. A dead hero. A handicapped hero. Both are ultimately useless. Ashido needs to evaluate herself right now. And if she finds she can't handle her injury, accept that she must leave the battlefield. Ashido-san. Midnight tried again, easily noticing the pinkette struggling to overcome her pain. If you can't, I can. I can do it. Mina interrupted shakily, forcing her body to obey her commands. Using which remaining strength she had, the pinkette pushed every bit of her will into getting her legs to straighten, to support her weight. She stood up. Competitor Ashido has decided to continue. Midnight's redundant declaration was met with loud cheers and raucous applause. Against the odds, the pinkette had garnered quite a number of fans in a short amount of time. The 18-plus only heroine stepped back, sharp eyes picking up just how wobbly the pinkette was now. The Ravnet shook her head. She knew exactly how this was going to play out. But as a teacher, the least she could do was accept the choice of the incredibly brave and foolish girl before her. Tetsu kept his eyes on Midnight until he was given a nod of affirmation. And the fight began again. Ha! The steely teen roared as he charged forward. He'd decided while he'd been waiting that he would answer the manly feelings of his opponent. He'd show her just how seriously he considered her resolve to win. If she wanted to go out with a bang, he'd gladly provide her that final push toward glory. Then he skidded to a stop. Only a few steps away from his opponent, Tetsu saw that her eyes were devoid of consciousness. Before he could ask Midnight what he was supposed to do, Mina simply fell face first to the ground. Thud. And Tetsu wins the match, Midnight declared, face remaining impassive, by knockout. The Metal Man of Class 1B felt conflicted. A victory like this left a foul taste in his mouth. It was just so unmanly. Then again, it was a victory, and he knew he needed to learn to accept that not all victories were going to feel good. Seeing his red-headed copycat, from Class 1A, Kirishima, rush out from an exit tunnel and immediately run over to gather the pinkette into his arms helped Tetsu feel a little bit better too. Even better, instead of berating him for how the match turned out, the hardening user focused entirely on the girl he now held, spilling out a litany of encouraging words to her as he carried her away. Tetsu stood there for a moment longer. It was a surreal experience. There was clapping and cheers all around him. And he didn't really care. He'd won, and in the field, that was all that mattered. Glory and fame meant nothing to him now if they got his precious people hurt. Or killed. We're halfway through, folks. Let's get ready for the second half. Let's see some energy, yeah. I just want a match where the competitors don't go overboard. UA Sports Festival Stadium, waiting room number 1. Izuku stared at the thing sitting across from him, an incredulous look on his face. What this thing posing as a man had just proposed? Demanded even. It was. Are you insane? The Verdanet asked, tilting his head in honest shock and confusion. Tay hadn't stopped growling the entire time, ready at a moment's notice to attack. Even Lily was glaring at the fire intruder from where she hid behind her big brother, but still. Oh? Endeavor replied, a flaming eyebrow rising in contemptuous question. The temperature of the room rose ever so slightly with the number 2 hero's irritation. He'd heard this drivel all before. They always called him crazy, or insane, or a monster before bowing to his might. Or his money. Same difference. And what's so insane about my proposal? How about we start with everything? Izuku shot back just as calmly, using cursed blood heavily to keep his heart rate level and his tongue still. In case you didn't know, I already have a beautiful girlfriend who I love with all my heart. And I'm lucky enough that she loves me back. So right there's reason enough for me to not marry your daughter, who I've never met. Endeavor growled, his frustrations confirmed. That ugly mutant beach had already gotten to his target and had poisoned his mind. If he wasn't furious with the freak at that moment, he'd applaud Buru Asui for such a skillful move. Really, using her daughter to ensnare the naivety of youth with such an archaic notion as love? What a ridiculous farce. Whatever the Asui have promised you, you know that I can easily double. No, triple it, correct? Endeavor asked, trying again. The man knew from experience that love was only as deep as the wallet of the individual in question. If you're concerned about the repercussions from their firm, no, Izuku cut in, tightening a fist under the table out of sight from the pro-hero. It was strange, he was beginning to feel angry, but the volatile emotion was singing through his veins this time. I don't care about your money, and I don't care about your status or what you can do for me. I care about Tsu-chan, and I'm not betraying her. Yeah. Tsune is the best for Izuni. Lily added, doing her best to sound brave even when the fiery man really scared her. And Lily thinks that the fireman's family is bad in the head anyway. The glare that Endeavor turned toward the littlest zombie was dark enough that Lily had to bury her face in her big brother's back before she broke down and cried. There was murder in those eyes. She'd know. Go ahead, number 2, just try it. The unexpected addition of an unknown player into the standoff only seemed to make it worse. Touch even a single hair on anyone inside this room, and you won't like the consequences, the intruder continued, voice turning condescending, like a teacher reprimanding a student too stupid to understand what they'd done wrong multiple times. You do remember what those are, I hope? How does being removed from the hero rankings sound? Or having your little science project blacklisted from every hero school in Japan? 9. Both Izuku and Endeavor turned to the door of the waiting room, still hanging ajar after the number 2 hero's abrupt and unwanted entrance. The sight that greeted them was that of an adorable-looking cat boy, face scrunched as he tried his best to look serious and intimidating. He was also holding up some sort of official-looking card. Who do you think you are? Endeavor spat, flames billowing upward as he barely contained his fury. Izuku made to stand, ready to protect this child who'd so unwisely pissed off the flaming bastard he'd been stuck speaking to. Before he could fully get to his feet, he noticed Endeavor flinch back as the kid stepped close enough to shove his card in the man's face. What the hell are you doing here? Endeavor barked, oddly enough seeming to be working on keeping his words and tone measured. What business is this of some meddlesome QRA dog? I'm a cat, actually. The cat boy grinned back, boldly stepped around the flame hero and climbing up to stand on a chair so both living occupants in the room could see him clearly. And I'm doing my job. The kiddo here has caught the eye of quite a few people, you know, the UN included. We're keeping a close eye on him too, of course. So go ahead, push your luck. See where it gets you. You're already going to get it for being here in the first place. You know this room's off limits. Endeavor seemed ready to erupt like a volcano, his skin reddening and his flames growing out of control. Snarling, the pro-hero turned back to Izuku, slapping down a plastic container on the table along with a fat roll of yen notes. The roll was thicker than a soda can. Fine then, Endeavor grit out through clenched teeth. Wallow in the much with animals then, boy, I don't care. Fill that up and I'll be on my way. Izuku stared at the man in absolute incredulity while the cat boy looked like he'd just choked on a hairball. Did the number 2 hero really just Fork. No. The impudent denial was the last straw. Endeavor had never known defeat save against the infuriating idiot known as All Might, and he was going to get what he came for, damn it. If he had to get a little rough with the brat, so be it. And if the QRA agent had to suffer a little accident and disappear, well, it wouldn't be the first time. The roiling fire that covered the flame hero began to grow, roaring hungrily as it consumed more fuel. It was ready to burn. FFFSSSSHHHHHHHH. Until the frothy cloud of a fire extinguisher's foam doused Endeavor like a wet candle. Holy shit. Saki's voice filled the room, the blonde's brutal grin audible as she stepped into sight with the extinguisher in hand. You really know how to heat things up, eh boss? Endeavor wiped off his face, his flames already rising once more. Before, it was business, but now he was going to enjoy. A massive hand clapped down on the number 2 hero's shoulder, the air pressure from the action alone strong enough to put out his flames instantly. Endeavor. My old friend and rival. All Might cheerfully greeted, the number 1 hero grinning as always. However, there was an unmistakable edge to his boisterous voice. Why don't we take a walk? You look lost. With that, Japan's greatest hero dragged its second best away, ignoring the man's growls the entire time. From his spot atop the chair, Nyanta quickly slid down and crumbled bonelessly to the floor, trembling. His eyes were glassy and tears were threatening to fall down his lightly furred cheeks. I wasn't made for this kinda shit. The diminutive supervising agent whined. I think I just lost 3 from that. Saki-chan. Izuku said, discreetly calling for his most rebellious partner. I wouldn't mind if, next time, you hit him with that thing. The undead delinquent dutifully saluted with a vicious grin. That was an order she would be happy to obey. Maybe we should leave? Lily suggested, looking at the now wide-open door with worry. Lily thinks that the fiery man will return if we stay too long. Izuku nodded. Once the security of a place was breached, any feelings of safety it once had were gone. And besides, at that moment, all he wanted was to cuddle up with Tsu-chan. He really needed it right about now. Magnus. Next chapter will include the rest of this round of matches, and the way it will end will be special. Make, what's in a name? Dash for Henry Baumeister once again. Izuku found himself overseeing the restoration of the beach he had, by some forked-up turn of luck, come to own. Although honestly, he shouldn't be letting himself get too bent out of shape about it still if he were being truthful. Everything was actually going pretty well all things considered. The girls had finished cleaning up in record time, they'd built sturdy shacks that were firm enough to be counted as official housing, and the fence being erected around the perimeter was close to being finished. He'd have to look into getting the girls actual homes though, or get them the materials to build their own, but for now, the beach was almost ready for inspection by the police chief. If it got a green light from him, it was ready to be opened to the public again. One of his only gripes about the day though, was that Saki still hadn't moved from where she'd stopped to glare at the large sign placed atop the main shack yet. The blonde was glaring at it so hard that Izuku was pretty sure the whole thing would go up in flames any minute now. How in the forking hell? The delinquent growled. Did that cutesy-ass name survive? The innocent sign? It read Dorami. In English. Izuku personally didn't find anything wrong with it. Lily thinks it's a good name. Lily announced, prepared to dart behind her big brother for protection if needed. Strangely, her mean older sister never responded to her bait. Reiko. Saki, suddenly bellowed, freezing all of the girls in place. Why the hell didn't you change their forking name? Before the aforementioned girl could respond, the blonde had shot off like a rocket, chasing the violet all over the beach. From where he stood, Izuku watched the scene unfold, still confused. The name wasn't that bad. In fact, it actually sounded perfect for the club. It made the girls sound friendly regardless of how passionate they could be. What's so wrong with that name? Izuku asked aloud, not really expecting an answer. Perhaps this Kuroko could explain? Jumping slightly, Izuku whipped around to see a small girl, sporting a frame so thin he worried she was sick, had snuck up on him from seemingly out of nowhere. The brunette had her hair in a set of twintails, and had an incredibly serious look on her face. "'Tis a forbidden topic to be sure, but as you are the overboss, it's your right to know." Izuku sighed. It was bad enough when Saki called him boss, but now these girls had taken it to the extreme. He doubted he'd ever get used to the over-the-top moniker. "Ah, this Kuroko remembers it clearly," Kuroko said, looking into the distance as she began to recount the tale. It all began when. Flashback. It had taken a great deal of effort, of pain and blood and tears, but the gang was finally growing, both in numbers and territory. To commemorate such momentous achievements, Saki had a fantastic idea. The girls were going to get together and paint the town red. Well, paint the town with their gang's name anyway. It'd be all over the place. If they'd conquered it, it would be there. In English. "This is going to be awesome," Reiko had shouted to the four winds. "Saki will be so proud of us." At the last minute, their boss, the young woman who'd gathered them together when they'd been nothing but broken pussies, the one who'd turned them into a force of nature no one would mess with, had been called away. Saki Nikaido hadn't been able to be there, for their graffiti spree after all. But none of the girls had complained though. Their boss's old man was surprisingly alright, and he'd needed her help in restoring an ancient 2000 Mustang of all things. Honestly, there wasn't a member of the gang who wouldn't have gladly killed to be allowed to even touch such an antique. Certainly, Makoto, one of the high-ranking members, had seconded. The tall, short-haired brunette had looked so proud of their handiwork. "The name of our gang will be immortalized as of today. There's not going to be a single person who won't know of us." Cheers and boisterous laughter had filled the alley of their last tagging, the last bit of territory that had needed their name stamped on it. In the background, standing apart from the joyful chattering, a newer, blood member had only sighed in exasperation. These girls had meant well, but the boss was an actual badass that, while similar to the ensemble that had broken her heart, had guided them all to a better fate than they would have had alone. But there had been some dysfunctional misunderstanding somewhere along the line. "The boss is going to be really upset," the short girl had muttered to herself. "This Kuroko just knows it." When Saki had first named the gang, she'd taken the kanji involved and used their sounds in the English language to shorten it to an easier-to-remember logo. They were the beautiful raging demons. Thus, shortened they were. Do-Ra-Mi. Kuroko had mustered the courage to look up at the gigantic tag written in English letters once again. It had been one of an identical set of 10 spread out all across the city. Do-Re-Mi. The boss was going to, oi. Saki's voice had filled the alley, silencing the girls in a heartbeat as they instantly gave her their full attention. "What's the forking meaning of that? Isn't it the greatest forking thing?" Reiko had replied with a huge grin, obviously proud of herself. She'd put up the tags with the other girls all by themselves. Saki had to be proud of them too. "Just as you'd wanted, boss," Makoto had added, her seriousness doing wonders at adding fuel to the enraged blonde's already violent mood. "Now the name of our gang will be known everywhere." Kuroko had made herself as small as possible, inching closer to a nearby container. She'd known what was about to happen. "You forking morons." With that war cry, Saki had begun to, passionately, explain to her girls how exactly they had forked up. End of flashback. And on that day, Kuroko said, reaching the end of her story, this Kuroko learned that the boss can accurately strike a target at 200 meters. With a wrench. Izuku looked at the thin girl with a deadpan stare. On one hand, he wanted to berate the girls for their lack of common sense. On the other, he'd rather they keep the cutesy name. It was better for the beach in his opinion. You know what? Whatever. Izuku decided not to interfere further, he had more pressing matters to attend to. "Saki. Gather up the girls." It was time to give Do-Re-Mi a long-term project. The beach needed to be reopened to the public, and the girls needed money to make a living. In a different timeline, Izuku might have told the girls to just finish their work and open the beach to the public as it was, only keeping an eye on it to keep it clean. However, after dealing with how their society worked for so long, this Izuku had decided that if the public wanted a beautiful place to visit and stroll through, then they needed to pay for it. It was only fair. Oh, make dream come true, for all about nothing cloistered away inside the Asui household. 2 mothers and 2 children had been watching the yearly UA Sports Festival together with bated breath. The pair of mothers had been on the edge of their seats the whole time, their hearts nearly failing multiple times as they watched their children. Just recently they'd barely survived a powerful attack from one of their competitors. At the same time, the tadpoles with them continued to cheer for their big sister and her boyfriend. To them, it was beyond cool how the two looked as they earned victory after victory. Then, it happened. For one reason or another, Su had taken hold of Izuku's head and pulled the Verdana down to eye level. Then she'd given him an incredibly passionate kiss on live television. That was being broadcast to the entire world. Samidare and Satsuki didn't understand what was happening, of course, but their mothers were sporting large grins and were actually about to jump out of their seats. Then their big sister and her boyfriend finally separated and "Marry me." Crash. Inko had dropped the mug she'd been holding. The young-looking woman held back a waterfall of tears, her eyes now unfocused as she fanned herself. Buru, always so unflappable, seemed frozen in place. "My little baby boy," Inko whispered, slowly rising to her feet, "is becoming a man." Remaining at her spot on the couch, Buru pulled out a binder from who knows where, and opened it. Taking out a pen that had been kept in the binder, the frog woman began to write down dates. This event had just moved everything up. But she surely wasn't going to complain. "Oh my, son is so manly," Inko shouted, unable to control herself any longer. Buru nearly croaked when the younger-looking mother ran to her and snagged her hands eagerly. Luckily she'd finished her quick scribbling just in time. Samidare and Satsuki still didn't understand, but this time it was about why their mother was doing a silly dance with Ms. Inko around the living room. The two adults were singing, too. About weddings, dresses, paperwork, and grandchildren. It was all so weird. Deciding that it was just grown-ups being silly, the two returned their attention to the screen. In the doorway hallway between the kitchen and the living room, hands full of snacks and more beverages, Ganma sighed to himself. He'd heard everything too, and he was happy about it, of course, but what are they going to do when they remember Tsu-chan actually has to say yes first? The father of 3 certainly hoped this moment of brightness wasn't a prelude to further problems with the festival. That Todoroki boy seemed like a bomb with a short fuse, and Izuku had made it clear he wasn't going to avoid striking matches. Chapter 33, Sinister Turmoil. Hidden away in one of the lesser-used tunnels of UA Sports Festival Stadium, 2 truly massive figures were locked in the middle of a heated staring match. The larger of the two, a living legend larger than life, was the #1 hero, the symbol of peace. The other, burning in impotent rage, was his shadow, the #2. What is the meaning of this all might? Endeavor growled, barely keeping his tone civil though nothing could hide the scorn of his words. "Of all the times for you to stick your nose in my business, my family, why now?" To say Endeavor hated All Might would have been an understatement, but few understood that a significant portion of that loathing was more directed at the #1 as a person rather than as a hero. The larger man's ever-present smile, his constant failure to take things seriously, it made a mockery of every other pro in the country. It was as if the blonde were always just on the cusp of teasing that the rest of Japan's heroes were unimportant, that the gap between him and the rest of them was insurmountable, too impossible to even understand. It made Enji Todoroki's blood boil. Perhaps before attempting to tackle the problems of expanding your family, All Might returned, the mightiest hero's smile dimming to barely wider than a thin line. You should be more concerned with the problems your family already has. Even with his status as the number 2 hero, even with years of experience in the field, even with his hard-earned reputation as an unflinching warrior, none of that could keep Endeavor from cringing away from the nearly scowling All Might. The flame hero took an unconscious step back from the unnatural sight. "What about Shoto?" Endeavor asked, his mind quickly discarding all of his failures and focusing on the only family worth mentioning. The blonde fool couldn't know of the hardships he'd faced in his quest to create his masterpiece. Not that they mattered now anyway. He's passed to the second round of the tournament. There was never any doubt he would. Just as there's none that he'll continue to the next after that as well. He has no equal after all. Clenched fists and a hardening glare were the number 2's only answer. The burning pro forced himself to swallow normally in the face of such raw frustration from the normally jovial symbol of peace. No equal? Weren't you paying attention? All Might nearly hissed, voice still loud enough to echo in the empty tunnel. The number 1's brows furrowed. That is not the issue here. Young Todoroki nearly froze another student solid. She could have died, and with his next opponent being far more susceptible to cold than normal, his apparent lack of self-restraint could lead to disaster. Endeavor clicked his tongue, muscles suddenly unclenching as he realized this was just another instance where their views clashed. He'd been concerned for a second there. Well, what do you expect? The flame hero groused, crossing his arms defiantly. My masterpiece is vastly superior to any other. Those around him should understand that by now. All Might blinked at the audacity of the man before him. On a roll, Endeavor continued, completely missing the disbelief of the mighty hero standing before him. In fact, I find it unfair that my Shoto is being asked to go easy on these brats, the flame hero spat. If they can't handle his power, then they should do themselves a favor and just quit while they're ahead. The air in the tunnel suddenly grew cold, the air becoming weighed down by some unseen pressure. Even the roiling flames of the number 2 hero sputtered and grew weak. All Might was reaching the limit of his patience. UA is not in the habit of sheltering those unwilling or unable to show consideration for human life, the symbol of peace said with a true, undeniable scowl. If young Todoroki is unable to keep himself from harming others, the faculty will have no choice but to have him expelled and admitted to a program for those with quirks that require specialized methods of control. Endeavor frowns, his mind skipping like a record off track, the words spoken too bizarre to be processed. There was no way All Might had just threatened him with taking away his masterpiece. And for merely showing the power he'd worked so hard to create? Unacceptable. You wouldn't dare. Whatever rant Endeavor might have thought to make was instantly quelled by the ferocious electric blue glare that seared into him, as soon as he'd opened his mouth. The surrounding pressure had spiked as well, almost causing the flame hero to fall to his knees. All Might wasn't in the mood. Young Todoroki has already been warned. And I fully support Principal Nezu in his decision, the number 1 hero added, hard and sharp as steel. And if you think your prestige will help you this time, my friend, understand this. The backlash UA would face from expelling the son of the number 2 hero would pale in comparison to the uproar that would be caused if we waited until he actually took the life of another student in a childish tantrum. Warning given, All Might straightened and turned to leave. Too outraged to speak, Endeavor could only watch in silence as the symbol of peace walked away. At the last second before turning a corner, the mightiest hero stopped and gave the flame hero one last look, iconic smile back in place. But you shouldn't worry, All Might said, a cheerful tinge to his words. I'm sure whether it's here at UA or with the dedicated staff working at the readaptation program, young Todoroki will eventually make a wonderful contributing member of society. As soon as the number 1 hero had said his piece and disappeared, Endeavor hastily snapped himself out of his shock and took out his phone. He'd come too far and sacrificed too much for a bunch of 2-bit washed-up wannabes, who were so sheet up being heroes that they had to work at a school of all places, to decide they didn't like how his creation acted. while his efforts to acquire the genetic material for an even more powerful model were currently stalled. He couldn't risk his current masterpiece getting thrown off the path to #1 spot. A dark smile grew on upon the burning face of the flame hero, thrown in stark contrast by the writhing flames of his quirk. If they thought they were going to stop the Todoroki legacy from achieving ultimate greatness, they had another thing coming. His lawyers would see to that. UA Sports Festival Stadium, Contestant Arena. Meanwhile, the match between Momoyasu and Fumikage Tokoyami had kicked off without delay. Their flamboyant introductions had earned plenty of cheers and applause, and while the beatific heiress had originally seemed as stoic as ever, it hadn't taken a genius to see that the avian teen had come onto the field much different than before. His normal, melodramatic extravagance had been tossed aside and, as soon as the match had begun, he'd seemed to merge with the quirk entity inside him. Boom. Momo barely evaded the massive blow with a combat roll, straining against the instinctive desire to look back and see what further damage had been caused to the arena floor since the match had started. Keeping her focus, the nimble Ravnet instead activated her quirk and created her go-to kite shield. Turning, she faced her opponent with a frown, the sight that greeted her almost causing her to wish she'd foregone the additional protection in favor of a more maneuverable position. Where she'd just been only moments ago, was now a sizable crater in the ground. Bam! Before she could react, Momo found herself ragdolling backward, the sudden impact causing her newly made shield to sail away. Too busy trying to keep herself in the ring, the heiress didn't notice the iron and steel construct embed itself into the far wall due to the force. The audience, however, had no such problem. Holy moly folks! The little Lord of Darkness, the Prince of Shadows himself Tokoyami is still powering through this match like a freight train unleashed. In the face of such an onslaught, what can our canny heiress possibly do? Momo shook her head to clear it of cobwebs, regaining her senses and unfortunately having to agree with the distracting commentary. The shadow-covered Tokoyami hadn't given her a single second since the match had started to create anything more useful than the simplest of builds. She couldn't even get enough time to create her favorite flashbang Matryoshka dolls. And it went without saying she'd been dodging his crushing blows by a hair's breadth the entire time as well. Like now. Boom. A cloud of dust and debris exploded from where the two combatants had been, obscuring them both from the eyes of the world. All anyone could see is that the avian teen's latest attack, a mighty stomp, had left quite the crater behind. Tokoyami is proving another truth of the world of heroics. While many prefer to stick to the claim that brains of brawn is the better tactic, there will always be instances where it won't matter how smart you are against opponents with overwhelming strength. That being said, something isn't right here. UA Sports Festival Stadium, Class 1A seating box. Fork. Izuku cursed under his breath, mindful of those present around him even as he realized what was happening down below. Fumikage is really hurting. While most of his classmates were too far away or too engrossed in the destruction below to hear him, Sa caught his murmuring just fine. The frog girl, having been contentedly sitting in her boyfriend's lap, leaned back into his chest a little more to offer wordless support in the face of the Verdanet's introspection. "Apologies Midoriya-san, but I couldn't help but overhear," came the calm voice of Mezosha Uji, one of Class 1A's gentle giants, as the multi-armed teen leaned forward from his seat in the row above the couple. Careful of the floating clothes hanging off one of his human-looking arms, the Sylvette lowered a transformed tentacle for Izuku to see, the appendage, currently wielding an overgrown ear on the end. "Could you please elaborate?" The young necromancer grimaced, a troubled look darkening his freckled face. It wasn't that he didn't want to explain what was going on, it was just that he lacked the words. How could he put it in a way that didn't? "Fumikage and Kyauka became a couple recently," Sa blurted out, blunt as always. The statement turned many startled glances from their surrounding classmates. "He's upset because he saw her get hurt and can't do anything about it." Nods of sympathy rippled through the present members of Class 1A at the explanation. On the far side of the group, however, Feelings of frustration and jealousy had to be stamped out by Kaminari and Sero. The pair still saw their teachers from the garden had completed their re-education as men and then still refused their offers of a second date. Even farther separated from the rest of the class, Ojiro launched to his feet and walked away, a scowl carved across his plain features. As if their public display of affection wasn't enough of a slap to the face, the two lovebirds had to then reveal that there was another couple in the class. It was just too much. He really needed to make a phone call. Completely ignorant that their tailed classmate had left in a huff, the remaining members of 1A continued to focus on the latest revelation. Lily thinks Fumina should talk to Mr. Candy Cane, the littlest zombie chirped, deciding that she should try to brighten the mood with a little cheerfulness. And if Mr. Candy Cane apologizes, Lily just knows that everyone will be able to be friends again. The undead brunette was completely oblivious to the awkward smiles that surrounded her after she'd finished speaking. The older, less naive students didn't want to burst the little ball of sunshine's bubble, but imagining Todoroki apologizing was almost impossible. Almost as much as forgetting his new moniker would prove to be. If by talk, you mean tear that asshole a few new ones and leaving him a head shorter on both ends. Saki sneered, suddenly speaking up. Then yeah, that might just work in cooling feathers off. At that rather gruesome description, the remainder of Class 1A felt the sudden urge to return their attention to the arena below. UA Sports Festival Stadium, Contestant Arena. Momo couldn't help the cry of distress as she tumbled out of the way of yet another overwhelming attack by her raven-headed friend. The heiress had been forced to cease all attempts at defending herself and had switched instead to flat-out avoiding Tokoyami at all costs. That single strike to her kite shield had been enough for the revenant to understand that the roiling shadow creature that was the avian teen was honestly trying to hit her, and her still trembling arms were proof enough that she wouldn't be able to withstand a lucky blow with such brute force behind it. Boom. Yet another section of the arena was reduced to rubble and crater. From her position, Midnight looked on with increasing worry. This match had gotten out of hand the instant it was clear that Tokoyami was behaving uncharacteristically, aggressive and not holding back. If he wasn't careful, there'd be another instance of a student getting seriously injured. The R-rated heroine had honestly considered calling the match, but per the school's policy in regards to combat, she ultimately decided that until she was sure her raven-headed student was beyond reason, limiting her involvement to readying her quirk for immediate use was the most she could do. And it wasn't like she couldn't understand where the avian teen was coming from. She'd been there, on the field, when Tokoyami and Jiro had made their relationship official. She'd seen that spark in their eyes that had signified there was something deeper than teenage infatuation between them, that theirs was not a spur-of-the-moment thing. The sight had set her romantic heart ablaze, even as it tugged on past aches, and it was only the fact that they were in the middle of the festival that had allowed her to calm down so quickly. But that was how she knew. Fumikage was lost in his rage, unable to pull himself out of the all-consuming fury and self-hatred he'd fallen into from watching his queen harmed beyond the limits of acceptability. It was almost like watching Shota after what had happened to Emi, all over again. This was war. Kura and Ek. Boom. A large section of concrete, ripped from the ground, had just gone sailing through the air, out of another cloud of dust, and slammed into the reinforced walls of the stadium's field with astonishing force. Momo had been able to avoid the projectile, but it had been a close call. If the Ravnet, and the observing public, had expected the avian teen to tire at some point during his furious rampage, they were all disheartened when reality smacked them in the face. Indeed, Tokoyami only continued to stomp after his prey like an unflinching, unnatural disaster. Stomp. Stomp. Poor Momoyarazu. The heiress had been caught in the middle of a war she'd been completely innocent of. There's nothing for it then. Momo muttered to herself, accepting there was only one option left to her now. She couldn't hold out much longer, the entirety of the festival was catching up to her. Fatigue was turning her limbs to bricks, and her sharp mind was flagging even now. Clenching her hand into a fist, the Ravnet sent a determined glare at her opponent. This is it. It's now or never. With a wordless battle cry, the heiress charged. The public, around the world and there in the stadium, gasped as one at the daring action. In the announcer's booth, Aizawa and Yamada held their breath in unison. From her spot, Midnight raised an arm, ready to tear back the thin, skin-tight fabric and unleash her quirk. And then, Tokoyami-san! Momo screamed as she lunged forward, almost within reach of the hulking form of her beshadowed friend. Enormous claws of the purest darkness rose up in reply, awaiting the approaching frame of the Amazonian Ravnet. Crimson eyes full of pain overlaid by yellow bolts of fury glared forward, unwavering. Momo thrust out an open hand against the living onslaught. HSSSS. Bang. Flash. Re-e-e-e-e-e-na. Two sets of shrieks tore through the air, the louder of the two sounding more animalistic than human. A blinding light detonated into existence, filling the world with searing white. The luminance was so sudden and unexpected that even those watching from low-grade televisions far away were left with sore eyes. For those there in person, pro and civilian alike, it felt like red-hot pokers had gouged out their eyes for a split second, followed by realizing their visual sense had been burned away. Midnight, in particular, suffered the worst of it, being the closest outside of the competitors, and having been staring directly at the two as they'd clashed. In her final act of desperation, Momo had taken another page from Izuku's book. She'd managed to acquire the composition of his stun rounds before the match, knowing Dark Shadow was sensitive to strong light. Unfortunately, the formula was somewhat delicate, and required finesse to manufacture and sustain. It also turned out that the accompanying fuse and casings that Hatsum had invented for their mutual friend weren't just for show either, requiring delicate craftsmanship to create. In the end, Momo hadn't had the time to use her quirk for any of it. She'd had to make the call, cut corners, and, ultimately directly create the volatile mixture straight from her skin rather than encapsulate it within the safety of an official stun round. My deepest apologies, Momo said, slightly bowing to her opponent, never taking her eyes off the singular avian teen, now bereft of shadows. The hand the heiress had created with her left, now sported an ugly burn, thankfully not too deep, although it stung fiercely. But I had to stop you. With that, the Ravnet moved in to grapple her stunned raven-headed friend. She had no idea how long it would take Dark Shadow to reform, so she couldn't waste a second if she wanted to capitalize on this chance and secure her advancement. I will not. Tokoyami wheezed, lowering his hands from where they'd instinctively risen to rub at his eyes. Forcing them open, irritated, bloodshot crimson locked onto approaching onyx. The glare was intensely intimidating. Be stopped here. Without warning, the avian teen lashed out, decking Momo square inches the face. The force of the blow threw the heiress back, causing her to stumble. There will be. Tokoyami growled out, his black feathers standing on end as he stood up straight. The raven-headed teen loomed over, the girl he'd just punched in the face, those watching cringing back from the ferocious appearance he posed. Vengeance for my queen. When Momo managed to fight through the pain in her jaw and look back up at her opponent, she couldn't help but gasp in horror. Tokoyami and Dark Shadow had merged into a single being once again, a writhing existence of pain and sorrow. The notable difference this time, however, was that while the quirk entity was covering its host as before, instead of its usual corvidin shape, its appearance was now more akin to agonizing tentacles of living pitch set ablaze by midnight flames arching to reach salvation only to lash out against anything and everything. If there were eyes present, they were in no way stable, in number or appearance. There was bloodlust in those shattered spikes of yellow. Screeching some unintelligible cry, the nightmarish Tokoyami was on the down president of Class 1A in the blink of an eye. Two of what could pass for arms amongst the mass of writhing shadowy tentacles rose up, ready to crush anything in their path. From their places, Midnight and Cementos finally managed to recover their eyesight. In less than a second, the two pros were able to call upon years of experience and understood the dire situation before them. Without needing to communicate or wait for an official order, the duo leapt into action and activated their quirks. Between Momo and the out-of-control Tokoyami arose a wall of concrete molded from the arena itself, spawned into existence so that the two could no longer see each other. Aided by a single one of Midnight's battle fans, a billowing rosette cloud of narcotic pheromones came rolling toward the competitors, inching closer, but ultimately too late. Fumikage Tokoyami tensed, shifting his body sideways before screaming out his anguish, his pains, and all of his sorrows. Crack boom! As one, the raised limbs of Shadow struck the ground, an unholy god, sundering the mortal world. For 1.5 kilometers in every direction, the earth itself shook. The air pressure alone was enough to blow Midnight's pheromone cloud back into the stands behind her, causing quite a few attendants to immediately pass out. The concrete wall that had been raised to shield Momo crumbled like wet paper. More than that, the entire arena was cleaved in twain, one side jutting up noticeably higher than the other. The crevice lanced out in either direction, leaving a crack that wove its way all the way up into the stands on either side, splitting seats as easily as blades of grass. And in the thick of it all, the epicenter of such destruction and woe, Momoyarazu sat awestruck, unable to believe her eyes. Tokoyami had turned away from her at the last second, his attack completely missing her. Oh wait. How? What in the? Present mixed distraught and stuttering voice echoed, both literally and figuratively, the sentiment of the general public at large. For the pro heroes watching, in person and abroad, it was the silence of the more level-headed and pragmatic eraserhead that was more worrisome. In their booth, Aizawa was futilely clenching his phone. Midoriya had sent him a message at some point, and he just now read it. From Problem Child T plus JC Mad Todoroki's use of force as a teacher, Aizawa knew he should be grabbing his microphone and giving his raven-headed student a stern reprimand for his actions. He knew he should be preaching that feelings and emotions, especially darker desires such as those for revenge, had no place in the path of heroism. He even knew he should have gone the extra mile and outright stated that giving into the impulse to seek retribution against those who'd wronged their loved ones was never the right answer. As a hero, Eraserhead knew and understood these lessons perfectly. As a man, speaking them aloud would have made him the greatest hypocrite outside of politics. He had no right to judge others, for the very same sins he himself had committed. Back in the arena, while the vast majority of onlookers were dealing with their own shock, Tokoyami himself was no longer covered in shadow. The avian teen had a downcast look upon his face, and he refused to raise his head. The whispers of the public might have been too low for him to hear, but he knew they were judging him at that moment. Competitor, Toko? Midnight broke off from her attempt at engaging the no longer rampaging student, feeling a shift in the air. Tokoyami had raised an open hand, palm up, and was looking at the R-rated heroine with tears in the corners of his eyes. Sighing, the Ravnet understood the silent plea for a chance to speak. All right. Midnight acquiesced, slowly walking over and handing the mic over. Here. Make it quick. The stand seemed to take a collective breath as all present waited on the edge of their seat. What was this unholy mix of emitter and mutant going to say? Would he be declaring his superiority? Would he open a challenge to all who wished to face him? Or had he burned everything he had and was now retiring with grace? I apologize for my earlier behavior, but I refuse to continue this farce any longer. Fumikage spoke into the mic, a surprising amount of level-headed clarity present for the boy who was known for his theatrics. Those who knew him couldn't decide if the raven-headed teen lacked the energy to keep up his normal facade or genuinely believed he'd be misunderstood if he didn't speak plainly. I have tried, and failed, to keep my emotions in check. My heart aches for retribution for the one I love, but in seeking it I allowed dark thoughts to cloud my judgment, and almost committed an unforgivable act. A sense of relief flooded through the stadium, and to a degree, through the homes and bars and other establishments where eager viewers had waited with their hearts in their throats waiting to hear from the teen with such powerful abilities. As a whole, civilians took the admission as a dark quirk user recognizing how dangerous he was and willfully allowing a more controlled and deserving competitor continue, as was proper. In contrast, pro-heroes with any real experience and merit understood that this teenager had managed to claw himself back from the edge, just in time, and had made the hard call to remove himself from a volatile situation, before an accident could occur. I hereby retire from this competition. I acknowledge my limits, and cannot guarantee myself restraint at this time. Fumikage continued, unknowingly, and uncaringly, earning points with the watching public. If I were to continue to eventually face off against my classmate Todoroki-san, it pains me to say I suspect I would do everything in my power to exact my revenge on him for what he did to my beloved. And I cannot in good conscience allow that to happen. Thank you. After stiffly bowing to the nearest camera drone, Fumikage returned the mic to a wide-eyed, but proud, Midnight and gave an about face. Keeping a steady pace and his head held high, the avian teen left the arena, not as a beast ruled by emotion, but as a man. And as soon as he cleared the exit tunnel and disappeared from view, Fumikage wasted no time in running full tilt to the infirmary. His beloved was still bedridden, and he would be there for her. Always. Well then. Midnight trailed off, hesitating as she realized her normal persona wouldn't fit too well in this situation. Deciding on just being normal for once, the shapely 18-plus only heroine forced a smile on her face and pushed on. Yaozu wins by forfeit. Momo sighed as a wave of cheering and adulation rippled through the air. That hadn't been how she'd wanted to win the match, and now the heiress felt undeserving of moving on to the next round. On top of that, the prospect of facing off against Todoroki held an even heavier weight now that she'd had experience fighting against a real powerhouse. What was she going to do now? Alright folks. You've waited this long. But now I tease the final match of the second round. While we repair the arena, you have 15 minutes to go grab yourselves a snack or do whatever else you need to. So get going. Yeah. As Momo left the field, a worried look on her statuesque face, Cementos took her place and got to work repairing the damage left by the students. Again. Honestly, the blocky pro couldn't help but wonder just how Aizawa managed to keep those little monsters of his under control. UA Sports Festival Stadium, Class 1A seating box. I'm glad he managed to snap out of it. Izuku sighed in relief, almost slumping in his seat. He could have really hurt Momo-san there at the end. Even as Tsuka croaked in agreement, and the zombie girls nodded along as well, the rest of Class 1A present found themselves worried. They'd always known Todoroki was insanely powerful, but now they'd discovered that their raven-headed classmate was strong enough to almost split a stadium in half. He might not have been as powerful as All Might, but he was still a beast. At that moment, certain less-than-stellar students from the heroics course felt the sudden urge to give an apology, gift to the newly discovered powerhouse that was Tokoyami. I should get going now, Karo, Tsu declared after a moment of silence. When the frog girl tried to stand up, however, she found that her boyfriend had slipped his arms around her, and refused to release her from his hugging embrace. A single glance was all it took for the amphibious teen to tell that her emerald necromancer was filled with worry for her. Karo? Tsu croaked, raising an expectant brow at the display. Now was not the time or place for her boyfriend to play the overprotective card. Instead of being released, the hug only became fiercer. I'll be alright, Karo, Tsu stated, trying to balance sternness with assurance. Everything will be fine, Izuku-kun. Izuku buried his face into the cool dip between his girlfriend's neck and shoulder, drawing as much comfort as he could for as long as he could. He really didn't want to let her go. I know, but the Verdananutsu was strong, far stronger than she looked. There was no doubt in his mind she was even stronger than many could ever hope to believe her to be, as biased as they were. Still. I just 1,000 fears swirled through Izuku's mind. What if Endeavor had ordered Todoroki to use this chance to get rid of their family's competition? What if Todoroki decided to ignore the consequences and take revenge for how they'd spoken down to him before, when he tried to explain himself to them? What if what happened to Kyauko happened again, where the consequences this time would be far more severe? What if, smooch, a sudden kiss, right on the lips, snapped Izuku back to reality, allowing him to regain his focus? "I'll be fine," Tsuyu repeated, staring deeply into the worried emeralds of her love. "Believe in me, Karo." Still reluctant, Izuku had no choice but to put his faith in his girlfriend and let her go. Hopping up, Tsuyu looked around and noticed even the zombie girls were looking at her with concern. Having once experienced the link, she knew her boyfriend's quirk created for herself. The amphibious teen knew the Verdanet's emotions were bleeding into the trio. 15 minutes later, UA Sports Festival Stadium, Contestant Arena. I teased that time again, folks. Are you ready for the final match of the second round of the first-year tournament? Let me hear you say yeah. After an enthusiastic response, the stadium's crowded stands began to vibrate with cheer and raucously applaud. Many couldn't help but wonder just what would happen in this match. So far the battles between the first years had run the gamut, from impressive to lackluster to truly awe-inspiring. Would the son of Endeavor bring his might to bear once more? Would he choose to wield his rarely seen flames this time? Perhaps they'd see another bout of martial prowess, only this time the born prodigy would show the lowly mutant the difference between facing a pedigree instead of a no-name hick. From the southwest gate, the son of Endeavor returns to the field. But don't get your hopes up, folks. Use of excessive force is still prohibited at this institution, and the rules do apply to everyone. How will the icy prince of the flame hero himself deal with his opponent this time after receiving a warning? It was a well-known fact that, after an infamous sting operation involving a notoriously promiscuous villainess, whose mantis quirk drove her to prey on both heroes and villains to ensnare into her bed, President Mick had developed a rather passionate dislike of mutant quirks. Due to the nature of the villain's quirk being labeled dark as well, such a designation also found its way into the voice hero's bias after a time. Even so, as a professional in both heroics and the scholastic field, the loud blonde did try his best to fare, even though he knew he probably failed just as often as he succeeded. And in this case, Asui's nature had no bearing on how President Mick dictated the last match of the second round. Todoroki had broken a cardinal rule of and deserved the punishment he'd received, if not more so. The heterochromatic was lucky the board had gotten involved, or the voice hero knew the son of the number 2 hero would have been disqualified for his action. Stepping up onto the raised arena platform, Shoto Todoroki's normally blank visage was marred by a tinge of worried nerves. The dual-colored teen had spent more than an hour writing out the oath provided and then signing it. He'd been recorded reciting it, and had then endured an extra lecture on safety in regards to quirk usage in heroics. Even hating such speeches as he did, he'd had known better than to say anything and had just listened with undivided attention. Afterward, he'd accepted a final word of caution, even as he'd swallowed the bile he felt creeping up his throat at having his mother's quirk compared to the bastard's. Todoroki did all of that, accepted all of it, because all he wanted, all he needed was to face and defeat Midoriya. The monster of UA had been assured victory against that religious fool. The inevitability had been obvious. How could one hope for plans to stand against the strength of living death? Such power was too dangerous to ever be faced in a contest of physical strength. In fact, all forms of melee were a no-go against him. Therefore, the metal copy of his red-haired classmate. He doubted the boy would even slow Midoriya down. No. He'd meet his rival in the final round. There was no other possible outcome. But for now, he'd need to overcome a seemingly impossible challenge. Defeat an amphibious opponent without heavily damaging them. For once, his mother's ice wasn't going to help him, and that fact burned. And from the northeast gate, here comes his opponent. I tease the girl who fears nothing and will give you a serious tongue lashing too. I teased Asui. As her introduction echoed through the stadium, Ran hopped from the entry tunnel to the arena platform. Whereas last time there'd been derisive giggles and snide comments on the frog girl's preferred method of mobility, now there were only anticipatory whispers. How would a girl with a mere animal mutation quirk like frog measure up to the overwhelming power of the legacy of the number 2 hero? What could she even hope to accomplish? Meanwhile, others who recognize the 2 family names of the competitors and their far from peaceful history, asked themselves if the current match had somehow been decided on behind the scenes. Let's hope she's come with a plan, am I right? Midnight allowed her eyes to roll at that one. This was not the time for that blonde idiot to throw around dumb jokes. The tensest match of the day, so far, was about to take place. And she needed to focus and do her job so that there were no tragedies today. It was bad enough that the school's legal situation had deteriorated to such a point already with what had happened to the Jiro girl. They were sure to get a mark on their record for failing to provide for the safety of all of their students, even with the leeway all hero schools were given. It was beyond fortunate that, had not only Recovery Girl but also Midoriya currently in residence. If the young necromancer hadn't been present, or such a good friend to the girl, her recovery might not have been so instantaneous or complete. That, of course, didn't change the fact that if Todoroki went all out in this match, even Midoriya's quirk might not be enough. Alright ladies and gentlemen, let's get started, Midnight called out, drawing once again on her experience as a pro to keep her increasing worry under control. We're, Asui, as stoic as always, raised her hand. Midnight stopped, blinking a few times before the sight and what it meant registered with her. Hiding a relieved sigh by stepping down from her podium, the R-rated heroine approached the frog girl and handed her the mic, much to the confusion of her heterochromatic opponent. The eldest daughter of the Asui family stared at the youngest son of the Todoroki family flatly. She raised the mic, and the dual-color teen felt his stomach drop. I refuse to fight against Shoto Todoroki at this time, announced. The words spoke of forfeiture, but the frog girl's tone hardly fit people's expectations. Furthermore, I refuse to work alongside him from this point forward as well. Grimacing at the additional declaration, Midnight knew interfering now would only make things worse. The R-rated heroine knew she could always try to foster understanding between the 2 scions in the future, but for now the bad blood seemed to be too new to be worked through. It wasn't necessarily the best situation for the 2 to be in, and hardly an acceptable one for heroes in training to partake in, but it was understandable if one were to see it from the perspective of an emotional teenager. Tsu was far from finished speaking. Hardly taking a breath, she continued. My classmate has shown multiple times that he has no qualms with the use of excessive force, bordering on lethal in one instance so far, against fellow classmates. Even, with the words being true, there were those in the audience present and abroad that scoffed at the frog girl's statements. What did she expect in the world of heroics, where you needed to be strong to survive? If that is what he deems as acceptable treatment for those he is meant to work with, then I cannot in good faith place my life in his hands. And yes, that means even here, in a glorified, sparring match. Todoroki felt as if he'd swallowed a lump of burning coal while being kicked in the balls with a red-hot iron. Those words. He'd heard them, or a form of them, before. That carefully crafted refusal was one of the official ways other pro-heroes had denied supporting the bastard when the Hero Commission had requested they aid the Flame Hero. To have them being thrown at him now, this issue has also been exacerbated by the lack of the proctor's capabilities in stopping my classmate, Sa said, steadily carrying on without stutter or flinch. The same could not be said for Midnight and Cementos, who winced at the truth of the words thrown in their faces. As pro-heroes, it shouldn't have mattered how powerful their students were, none of their lives should have been put in danger as long as they were present. If they couldn't act quickly enough to save my friend from him, I cannot trust they'd be any faster to save myself if the situation were to repeat itself here now. Scoffs had turned to murmurings and sneers from the audience. How presumptuous of a first year, to call out pro heroes as if she knew anything. There were many who were just about ready to call on UA to censor the frog girl that very moment, but before they could, said teenager had even more to say. My participation in this festival is over. However, before stepping down, I would like to say just one more thing, if I may? Tsu threw a glance at Midnight, the Ravnet merely shrugging. As hurt as she was by the harsh words spoken, the R-rated heroine knew they were truthful, and she accepted them as such. She was mature enough to know even as a pro she could still make mistakes and learn from them. Izuku Midoriya. My answer is yes. I will marry you. Midnight, along with an untold number of students, faculty, civilians, and pro-heroes alike all froze in place at the sudden declaration. Barely registering the return of her Mick, the 18-plus only heroine could only blink as reality far exceeded her expectations for once. Oh, she was so going to demand Power Loader give her a copy of the first-year tournament now. She had to rewatch the whole thing now. Right as Asui turned to leave, rosy-cheeked with a loving smile causing her normally apathetic face to glow, Midnight caught movement from the corner of her eye. Shoto Todoroki had taken a step forward. And the dual-colored teen did not look happy. At all. Asui. Shock. Anger. Despair. Todoroki's shout was full of a potent mix of emotions. This wasn't how it was meant to go. His path to redemption was supposed to start here, where he'd earn back the principal's trust along with another victory. He'd planned the entire scenario in his head down to the last detail. If he couldn't use his mother's quirk, then it would be a full-on martial arts bout. He knew he was up for the challenge, and would be able to show he could subdue opponents with the barest minimum of power. But he was going to be denied even that? Did she really hate him that much? What had he done to deserve this? He needed to stop her, convince her to keep fighting. If he could just have a chance, he knew he could control himself and not be a danger. Midnight stepped between the two members of Class 1A, her sky-blue eyes frigid as she locked gazes the apparent threat. The cold glare was paralyzing, and the heterochromatic found he couldn't move a muscle. For the entire length of time it took for Asui to hop her way from the arena platform back down to the nearest exit tunnel, the stare-down continued. The audience's response was mixed at best. There was booing and jeering, along with calls of disappointment at the lack of action. There were sighs of relief, as concerned parties afraid that the amphibian girl would suffer the same fate as Todoroki's first opponent found they could breathe easier. There were even a few smattering instances of applause, pros and civilians alike cheering for the courage of the frog girl for speaking her mind and accepting her limitations. UA Sports Festival Stadium, Class 1A seating box. At the supposed start of the match, Izuku had stood from his seat and gone to the railing, at the bottom of Class 1A section, to lean against it. The Verde Net had quickly ended up gripping the metalwork with both hands just to keep his emotions in check. No matter how he felt about it, he'd been ready to put his faith in his girlfriend, in her skills, and her intellect. Thank goodness. Izuku breathed, hardly able to speak. Absently, the relieved necromancer released the metal railing he'd been gripping the entire time Tsu had been on the arena platform. Who knows what would have happened if he'd been allowed to reach her. Of course, Izuku had been able to see the heterochromatic teen step forward. His blood had instantly caught fire, his muscles tensing to the extreme, and he'd even felt his eyes begin to burn. Then Midnight had stepped in, and Tsuchan had been able to walk away unmolested. "You okay, boss?" Saki asked, glancing at the section of railing the Verdana had been gripping. "Need some fresh air? A drink?" The railing was warped. Twin sets of 5 gouges had bent and twisted the metal under what looked like extreme tension and stress. "Hell, what about a blow? Lily thinks that hugs and kisses would do wonders for Zuni," Lily chirped, always ready to brighten the mood and interrupt her older sister's lechery. Tsune would surely appreciate hugs and kisses too. Yeah. Izuku trailed off, thoughts of hugs and kisses filling his head. That actually sounded like a wonderful idea. You know what? Why don't, wham. Goo. Tay slamming a forearm onto the railing, bending the metal around the limb like putty, earned the attention of the remaining members of Class 1A still present. The groan of frustration caused Izuku to chuckle. Yeah, Tay-chan, I hear you, the Verdana nodded, grinning faintly. He does deserve a wake-up call. But we have to get to him first. So until then, let's go. As Izuku and his zombie girls departed, Tay paused for a single moment, just long enough to eye the railing her master had gripped so tightly one last time. Seeing the evidence now erased under her own strike, the tall undead Ravna turned away and followed her family as they left. That imbecile endeavor was already after her beloved Izuku with only as much as he'd shown so far. The fool didn't need any further evidence of just how her master was growing. A little further away, a certain catboy decided that what he'd just witnessed was definitely not a clear case of intelligence. There was already far too much shit on his plate to add more conspiracy theories to the mix. And honestly, he'd already given up 3 lives for this. He wasn't interested in losing any more. UA, Sports Festival Stadium, Recovery Girl's temporary nurse's office. The sizable room, specifically designed to serve UA medical purposes for those off of the main campus due to the events in the stadium, was equipped with multiple large-screen displays tuned into the broadcast of the festival going on just outside. This allowed those inside, patients, friends, and Recovery Girl herself, to stay in the loop. It wouldn't do for any of them to miss a single moment of such an event. Kyauka, still laying in her assigned bed, sighed with no small amount of relief. Tsuchan had avoided the fight. Even better, Izuku wouldn't go into a bloody rampage because she got hurt. Yet, it was unavoidable at this point, but Todoroki had proven to be a real danger, and needed to be taken to task for his actions. Her parents had already been called, and after calming her old man down, she'd been able to assure them of her good health. Of course, she'd also been sure to report what her condition had been in when she'd arrived in the temporary nurse's office as well, and that her current state was a direct result of her good friend's direct intervention. Dull maroon eyes flicked from the rapidly changing displays to cherry red fingertips. Kyauka suppressed a giggle. She could still feel Izuku's quirk in her extremities, making her fingers and toes tingle. At first, her parents had been skeptical of Izuku. They'd understood his good intentions, but what good parents wouldn't have been given the creeps if they'd been told their daughter had been given a strange boy's blood to be healed? Kyauka certainly didn't blame them for their initial reactions. Although, she thought their quick acceptance of Recovery Girl's petition for blood samples and other tests, along with a period of observation, was a little much. They meant well, and she loved them, but geez. It's not like she ended up like her 2 neighbors who were also consigned to the temporary infirmary. Looking over, Kyauka sighed at the sight of the overly excitable pink ball of acidic joy that was Mina. The horned girl was still currently passed out in her bed. A potent mix of pain, exhaustion, painkillers, and a visit from Recovery Girl had put her to sleep quite thoroughly. It was honestly the stillest the punk rocker could ever remember seeing her. Beside the pinkette, also abnormally still and quiet, was Kirishima. The redhead was just sitting there, gazing at Mina like she was the world. Kyauka didn't think he even knew she and the other bed occupant were even there. That led the punk rocker to look over at Shiozaki, the religious zealot if she'd ever seen one. The Class 1B member was completely out of it, but even so her face was still contorted in some sort of pain. Kyauka guessed that the image of Izuku glaring down at her angrily was giving her nightmares. On top of her restless sleep, the pious girl was also going to have to deal with the mess that was her vine hair, as all of the strands that withered during the match were still either gone or only reached to just below her chin now. But if you asked her, it served the nut job right for being so pushy with her religious nonsense. As for Kyauka herself, Oh come on. The punk rocker fake moaned, fidgeting slightly. I'm not in danger anymore. Cut it out. On one side, completely ignoring her entirely empty pleas, Fumikage was hugging her, nuzzling his feathered head and cool beak against her cheek and neck. On her other side, also ignoring her false pleas, was Dark Shadow, doing the exact same thing. It was like being smothered by two overprotective boyfriends at the same time. She forking loved it. I've told you already, I'm not a delicate flower. Kyauka mumbled, trying and failing to sound annoyed. It was hard to do so when one was smiling after all. You two are such animals. Goddamn did it feel good to be so loved and not have to worry a single fork about her looks. Magnus, I know you're excited for the next couple of fights, but please remember that blessed with a hero's heart is next. Omake, bloody inside Izuku was having a rather difficult day, made more so thanks to meddling assholes all around. First, there was the sports festival itself. The internationally known event alone was cause for some students to tie themselves into knots, especially those that liked to overthink everything, regardless of nervous disposition though. It was a lot to handle for any first-year student who'd only had a little less than 2 months to train and prepare. Then there had been his discovery of the sheet that went on behind the scenes. Learning that the board and certain sponsors were literally gunning for his removal, one way or another, had made the whole thing nothing but a headache and a nightmare. Nothing said welcome to the rest of your life like a bunch of rich, bigoted forks sticking their fingers where they don't belong and trying to ruin your day. Everything had been sorting itself out fine though, until Todoroki began to overreact. Izuku was honestly still having trouble understanding where the heterochromatic sudden rivalry with him had come from. What had possessed the powerhouse of their class to see him, a dark mutant nobody, as a mile marker that needed to be beaten? And then the tournament happened. To be completely straight with himself, Izuku knew the only reason he'd agreed to continue participating was so that he could prove everyone wrong. It wasn't very heroic, but damn it, he'd had enough of everyone thinking they could have a say in what he was going to be. Yes, he might have been a mutant, and he might have had a creepy dark quirk, but he was going to be a hero. And his first step was going to be here, on a worldwide stage, proving he could face battle and adversity head-on and not be dead weight. If he hadn't achieved his goal by now, he didn't know how he could. Beating Shinso was one thing, a good start sure, but what had just happened against Shiozaki was another matter altogether. As he walked out from his waiting room and began the trek back to the seating area for 1A, Izuku raised his hand up for examination. Not for the first time, the Verdana wished he could look beneath the skin and directly see his quirk blood. What the hell happened back there? Izuku asked at a whisper, knowing no one was around, but it never hurt to be careful. He had his own theories of course, but he was still confused. How did I manage to do that? Sudden strength augmentation and increased speed. The two singularities kept his head spinning. The vines withering he'd been able to understand. Shiozaki had squeezed too hard, and in her angered state the thorns sprouted from her hair had pricked him and drawn blood. That, of course, had doomed her flora-based quirk. After all, he'd never said cursed blood was picky about where it got its nutrients. From there it had only been a matter of other unlucky vines brushing up against places where his blood was still smeared across his skin. I dunno boss, Saki replied, looking far too relaxed, walking with her hands behind her head, for someone whose neck had been snapped only an hour ago. But you looked beyond forking badass. Lily is just happy that Izuni won without getting too hurt. Lily cheered, although the littlest zombie was quick to fall back into her worrying. Everyone is getting too angry and violent today. That fiery bad man and Mr. Candy Cane especially. The brunette's concern was not ill-founded, and was sound enough for Izuku to pause for a moment. Both Todoroki men were becoming a problem. One wanted to beat him, and the other wanted him to. Don't worry about it, Lily-chan, Izuku eventually replied, giving the youngest of his partners a loving head pat. Everything will be alright. I just need to understand this new facet of my quirk, and we'll be all good. Desire? Instantly, Izuku snapped his head around, searching for a reflective surface. The closest thing he could find was a billboard along the wall that was advertising. Was that Aizawa-sensei's melatonin brand? Your desire? Whatever. Thankfully, the blown-up image of the bottled sleep hormone came with a large swath that was black ink, allowing Izuku to faintly see his own reflection. Or rather, the red-eyed image that was a clear indication of what was attempting to speak to him. And if it was asking him if he wanted to know what was going on, then he only had one answer. Yes, Izuku replied, continuing to speak softly to try and mask what he was doing. Silently, Lily, and Saki split up and encircled their master, each facing a different direction, facing outward to keep an eye on the hallways. If asked, each could only say it was almost like a feeling in their bones that told them they needed to do so, for the sake of Izuku. Replication. Amplification. Muscles. Ligaments. Tendons. You're saying you increased the amount of muscle fibers and connective tissues I have, and Izuku's mind whirred as it did its best to fill in the gaps. His quirk may have been powerful, but it seemed to still somewhat lack in the communications department. You made them better? Stronger? The reflection nodded. How does that even work? Izuku asked. He really needed to know, to understand what was happening inside himself. He had his theories and he had to know if they held true or not. Desire. Need. Give. Provide. Izuku deadpanned at his red-eyed reflection. That non-answer was either given on purpose, or worse, was an answer without context. Just the same, it still left him with more questions than answers. Ungwa, Tei's groan snapped Izuku out of his self-contained world, and the Verdainet was forced to acknowledge he was out of time. Right, Izuku conceded, looking away from the ghostly personification of his quirk. We need to go. Fumikage's match is about to start. And I really need Tsuchan right about now. With that, the boy with the cursed blood left to go and reunite with his beloved. As he walked away from his possessed reflection, he made a mental note to corner his quirk sometime in the future and have it actually explain how things between them worked. For real. Make bloody kindred, for Nathan Hurley in the growing shadows of twilight, Stain, the current boogeyman of Japan's heroes and back alleys alike, glared down from his perch as he slowly did a once-over of all of his armaments. Every day. Day after day, after day, after day. You go around preaching the sacred ideal of heroism, yet you don't even know what it truly means. For this man, long since labeled a villain by society, his work was nothing short of a purge. The world required a culling. The fakes and the false gods that the sheep so willingly worshipped needed to be stripped away, leaving only true examples of heroism to remain. It would only be then that the true heroes could retake the world from the clutches of nepotism and fabricated ideals and norms. This world is diseased. It doesn't need more fake heroes, glory hounds more interested in baying for riches and power than serving the greater good. This path he treaded was not one he'd taken lightly. It had been his last resort, his only option after years of doing things the right way. Once, he'd done his best to organize pacifistic protests, garner the goodwill of the public, and make a difference through legal means. When that had failed him, he'd turned to a more hands-on approach. If his words wouldn't change the minds of the people, maybe his actions would. So he'd set out to show the world how a true hero should deal with dangerous criminals, corrupt politicians, deranged villains. When they'd caught him, he'd been incarcerated with barely a trial. They'd tossed him away into a pit filled with those he'd had a hand in locking away himself. Stain suppressed a shudder at the ghostly fingertips of nightmares and memories. He still carried those scars, his proof that the world would refuse to change without blood, sweat, and tears. This world needs true heroes again. It needs those who won't be afraid to do what it takes to really save the day, to really make things better, to be both the sword and the shield. The sum of their actions cannot equal zero. Stain was sick and tired of existing in a reality that accepted the sorry state of the current hero society. The once virtuous calling, the sacred vocation, had been degraded and twisted into a mere profession. At the end of the day, the fakes were nothing more than security contractors who may or may not assist the common people on a whim. They had turned something noble into a business. The world needs more true heroes, like All Might. And him. At the simple reminder that there may be another on par with the purity of the symbol of peace, Stain's mind flashed back to the memory of the day he'd seen the broadcast. The fools and cowards had been quick to label him a monster, an undying creature that knew no bounds or sanctities. To the masses, the sheep, the survival of the divine and thrice-blessed final judge in the face of an assassination attempt had been relegated to a mere coincidence. As if that saintly woman had just been at the right place at the right time. But he knew differently. He knew the truth. The Green Child was a true hero. The necromancer, or the lich, whichever some idiotic fool had begun to call him, had clearly been unaware of the extent of his survival capabilities when he'd been shot. To Stain, that meant the boy had first thought of the survival of the innocent, in protecting the people, before his own safety. As a true hero should. Rescuing came first. Then fighting for what was right. If glory followed, so be it. And the violence demonstrated by the boy's undead pet? In Stain's opinion, nothing was too extreme when it came to true heroism. If it took ripping off an arm to keep a criminal from taking an innocent life, then that's what it took. That woman with the gun had clear intentions of killing anyone she needed to in order to save herself. Her punishment was richly deserved. Just like so many others. Down below, Stain caught fleeting movement out of the corner of his wide eyes. To those who didn't know him, it would have appeared as if an urban knight, in upgraded armor, were running full tilt through the alleyways. But Stain did know this one. His charity runs weren't a bad start, and he'd done quite a bit to erode away the remaining homeless populations in the ghetto areas. However, that couldn't excuse the fact that he also hogged the media by promoting his good deeds, ran what could be called a sweatshop of sidekicks to bloat his success rate, and arranged for captures to occur in certain ways so that conveniently placed media types could be there for the perfect photogenic angles. It makes no difference now. Time to see if you're more than just a fake and pretender. Hero. Wrapping his conviction about himself like a cloak, Stain readied himself for what was to come. With cat-like agility, and nary a sound, the hero killer began to move. Chapter 34, Sinister Special 3. Mai Hatsume, the self-proclaimed genius inventor better known as the mad demon of the support courses 1H, had known what she wanted to do with her life long before she'd ever even heard of UA. Even as a little girl, she'd wanted nothing more than to fill the world of heroes with her wonderful babies. Hatsume. Powerloader Sensei shouted in exasperation, waving a gauntleted hand through the air to disperse the acrid black smoke that had once again filled the development studio. Just another day of his wild student blowing something up, a vacuum chamber this time, for the third time this week. And it was still Tuesday. Enough is enough. I refuse to babysit you anymore if you refuse to actually take the initiative and learn to be safe while using the workshop. For once, Mai actually winced. While it wasn't her fault that the studio's supply of vacuum chambers contained faulty units, she did have to agree that she might have skipped a few more steps on the lab precautions and protocols list than needed. But Sensei, the pinkhead said, her tone a cross between apologetic and argumentative, I promise it won't happen again. And I'll even upgrade the, enough with that. Powerloader barked, still fuming. Mai flinched back, belatedly realizing she'd struck her teacher's last nerve with her latest failed baby. It had only been a matter of time, it seemed, just like with everyone else. And once again she had ended up in a situation like this, offering to fix her mistakes, even if the fixes might be hazardous themselves, but her well-intentioned repentance was blown off. From this day forward, you Hatsume are required to always operate with a partner while in the development studio. Powerloader declared, Even covered by his yellow helmet, appalled Mike could tell the pro hero carried a appalled Mike could tell the pro hero carried a deadly serious visage as he laid down the law. Hanjo-san, get in here. Scrambling for a way out of this sudden nightmare, Mai only succeeded in sputtering in place. This couldn't be happening. The very idea of being forced to share her studio space with someone who was probably not even half as smart as she was turning the Pinkette's stomach. This was worse than what had happened in middle school. Seeming to have been waiting for the order to come in, a petite girl with short, chin-length black hair entered the studio. At first glance, Mike could already tell she was just another, unremarkable taking up space in her studio space. Honestly, Mai had to wonder where Power Loader had even gotten a random student to stick to her like a leech. Sensei. The mad inventor tried again, but her fed-up instructor held on to the countenance of a man truly done and didn't look interested in hearing her out. No. This is final. Whenever I'm not available to watch over your reckless behavior, Hanjo-san here must be accompanying you, Power Loader said, elaborating Mai's punishment. Her quirk is best suited for dealing with your eccentricities and failures. Once again, Mai winced. However, as failure was the mother of innovation, the Pinkette didn't waste too much time berating herself. Hi. The unremarkable girl stammered out hesitantly as she stopped next to Power Loader's side. I'm Hanjo. Wait, no. You already know that. I hope we can be friends? Unless this is too soon? Using her quirk, Mai zoomed in on the Ravnet's face. Over the years, an unintended side effect of her passion for building her babies was that the Pinkette had had to deal with emotional unremarkables more and more often. To avoid problems, and a wasting of her time, she'd picked up a talent for reading micro-expressions. It was beyond clear this girl was uncomfortable to the extreme. Good, Power Loader boomed, looking between the two girls. Now that introductions are over with, I'm leaving. I've got a lot of work to do in the staff room. I hope, at the very least, that my development studio will still be in one piece when I return. With that, the armored pro left. If the man truly had such pending work ahead of him, or was just in dire need of a cup of coffee, neither student could tell. As was bound to happen when two strangers were forced together under unfavorable circumstances, a heavy silence prevailed after Power Loader's exit. Mai, unhappy to effectively have been saddled with a babysitter, crossed her arms with a pouty huff. The Pinkette wondered how long it would take this one to start stealing credit for her babies. Meanwhile, awkward and shy beyond measure, Hanjo could only stare in timid silence. I'm not going to get hurt because of this. Am I? The Ravnet asked, worry obvious. Mai's instinctual response, for once, choked. Even though she thought it was a stupid question, she really had no way to guarantee anyone's safety. Did she? That was the risk of baby making though. But it brought to mind a question. What class are you from anyway? In the same breath, the mad inventor turned away and started gathering up her tools. In doing so, the Pinkette missed how the unremarkable girl immediately rushed over to a table as soon as her back was turned and snatched up a scratched riot shield that had been left there earlier in the day. Had she witnessed the action, Mai might have been inclined to warn the interloper that the plastic slab was just about ready to break after taking the brunt of an earlier mishap. What do you mean by that? Hanjo asked, hurt clear in her voice. We sit next to each other in class. That unexpected information caused Mai to pause. Turning to look back at the interloper, the Pinkette stared, flatly in honest confusion. Wait, Mai said, brows furrowing, really? Shrugging, as the revelation had already lost its appeal, Mai turned back around and accidentally kicked a screwdriver some idiot had left on the floor. Remarkably, the stainless steel tool shot off like a rocket and flew straight for her pile of failed babies. In a cascading effect straight out of a slapstick comedy show from the pre-Quark era, the simple tool struck a junked baby, which in turn ricocheted back and hit another of its fallen siblings. The second failure, which had a coiled spring still left inside, finally released its tension, popping off the group at an angle to freedom. The bounce was short-lived, however, as the sprung baby quickly rammed into a precariously balanced and recently orphaned rocket glove. The bulky mechanized hand warmer slipped from its perch, hit the ground, and activated. Sparks flew through the air as the malfunctioning and discarded baby shot forward, sailing directly and at full speed toward the gaping Ravnet. Used to such acts of randomosity, Mai knew almost instantly where her wayward baby was headed, straight for the interloper. The girl looked clumsy, too timid to even dodge, and the shield she'd grabbed was about as protective as stiff tissue paper at this point. This was not good. Sensei would kill her if her babysitter kicked the bucket on the first day. Or worse, he'd kick her out of the studio for good. Before Mai could even shout at the unremarkable, it was too late. Ba-boom. The rocket-enhanced glove slammed into the battered shield, which the unremarkable had raised without so much as a flinch, and exploded. Right at the moment of impact, Mai could have sworn Zoom had enabled her to see the berserking baby smashing itself to bits as if it had hit a meter-thick wall of titanium. As the dust settled, again, the pinkette could only stare wide-eyed at the sight unveiled before her. The interloper hadn't even been moved a hair. It was like the heavy impact had been a light breeze. At that moment, Mai decided that her babysitter might just actually be interesting to have around. Now, what was her name again? Time skip Hatsune-san. Hanjo nervously called out as soon as she entered the development studio for the day. The Ravnet easily recognized the object in her partner's hands. Is that a gun? Hardly pausing to acknowledge the presence of Hondo, Hanju? Her tag-along. Mai aimed the gun at a target taped to the wall with a mad grin. Finding the sight wasn't exactly right, she lowered it and began adjusting. Yep. The pinkette replied, turning to look. Who'd in the eye. The Ravnet cowered back slightly. I was just waiting for you to get here to test it. That only caused the mad inventor's tag-along to visibly pale. I refuse to let you use me as target practice. The Ravnet shouted in distress. You're talking about a gun. Guns kill people. Hanjo's quirk, tank, allowed her to, well, tank any physical blow so long as she intercepted it with a flat object held in her hands while maintaining both feet on the ground, but she wasn't about to test her defensive stats against a freaking gun. Her specialty was programming, for crying out loud. It wasn't the most glamorous of skills nowadays though, what with support companies mostly looking for the more visible pizzazz of flashy hardware, so she needed the practice Bean Hatsume's partner would bring. But this. No amount of extra credit or hands-on learning was worth this. Hey. Mai pouted, actually looking offended. I wasn't going to shoot you. You weren't? Hanjo asked. Then why were you waiting for me? It doesn't fire explosive rounds. Does it? The flat look Mai directed at her tag-along was enough to cause Hatojo to cower in place. No, it doesn't fire explosive rounds, the pinkette replied, annoyance clear. She held up the firearm, yellow eyes almost glowing. In fact, this baby uses capture rounds, entirely non-lethal. They might not even hurt too much. Hanjo was thrown for a loop. Hatsume's inventions were always flashy and flamboyant. It was the mad inventor's default. Her babies caused loud noises, bright lights, and/or explosions as a rule of thumb. They were colorful in function or unnecessarily bulky in figure. The weapon in the pinkette's hand now was none of that. As blocky as it looked, the capture gun was far more reasonable in design than anything her crazy partner had previously invented while at UA. That doesn't actually sound like something you'd invent, Hanjo said while thinking, missing how the pinkette suppressed a wince at the offhand comment. There's too much common sense in it. So who commissioned it? Mai would have growled at the tag-along's flippancy with her method of baby making, but she'd since discovered that while the girl was timid in regards to a number of situations, when it came to their interactions, the Ravnet wasn't much afraid of her personally anymore. Which was kind of weird for the pinkette to consider, so really, she didn't bother. Maybe Ichi wasn't the only one worth remembering after all? Speaking of, a member of Class 1A actually, he's gonna be big, I just know it, Mai replied, completely missing the way her tag-along hid her face at the idea of a boy being big in any sense of the word. Anyway, I need you to fire this baby for me. Aim at the target. The one at the back of the workshop over there. Hanjo approached her partner, grumbling lowly. The noise sounded like a discontent kitten. She'd been so popular back in middle school, even being given the unofficial title of class pet. Even her best friend had admitted she was jealous of how much attention she'd been given on a daily basis. It was also different in high school. UA standards were different. The world of heroes needed precision, consistency, and reliability. All three were nearly the antithesis of her clumsy body. And for all her desires to be a programmer, her gamer habits didn't help her one bit either. She wasn't smart enough. She wasn't strong enough. She just wasn't enough. She'd gone from most loved girl to being thrown in the undesirables bin of rejects. Thankfully, while not up to her own standards, her programming skills had turned out to be her saving grace. As an uncommon skill, even that power loader appreciated her help a lot on various projects. Why do you need me to fire it? Hanjo asked, taking the gun from Hatsune. Firing it doesn't hurt, does it? If the pink cat had been the type of person to do it, she would have rolled her eyes at her tag-along. She was so needlessly cautious about a little pain. Of course not, it's totally safe. Mai exclaimed, suspiciously jovial all of a sudden. You've just got a lot more experience with this kind of stuff than anyone else in the class combined, right? Word is you're a hardcore gamer after all. The look that spread across Hanjo's face at this information could be described as severe offense. The Ravnut even stomped her foot with a huff. I'll have you know that my game is set in a fantasy world. Hanjo said, eye twitching. I'm called the Great Shielder, not the Great Gunner. I tried that one guns only game true, and even played some of those old FPS games too. But I'm not a gun nut. Even as she made her assertions, Hanjo handled the blocky gun far better than even an average police officer off the street would have handled their firearm. Aiming down the invention's sights as if it were second nature, the Ravnut belatedly realized something that slightly concerned her. And why are you hiding behind the safety shield? Power Loader had installed large slabs of ballistic glass on one side of the studio a few days prior. That the arrangement fanned out from Hatsune's workspace specifically was a fact that clearly never crossed the Pinkette's mind. Oh, no reason. Mai exclaimed with a grin while huddling behind two overlapping glass walls. Hanjo shook her head with a sigh. Focusing, she focused back on her target, and pulled the trigger. Time skip Mai asked as she took in the sight that greeted her after entering the development studio. Her partner was toiling away, as usual, on a new invention, but this time, something was unusual about it. It was Is that a wheelchair? It was hard for the Ravnut to believe, but it was true. The mad demon of the support course was really and truly working away on a perfectly normal-looking wheelchair. It was so brutally different from the girl's own first serious invention, a pair of smart glasses that provided a heads-up display to the user for everyday life, that it almost made her laugh. Yeah, Hanjo-chan, it's a wheelchair alright. Mai replied tiredly. For once, the Pinkette looked as run down as she probably felt from working nearly 24/7 on her babies. However, that didn't keep her from working any harder on her current project than she normally would. Ichi got really hurt during that whole mess at the USJ. He's gonna need this for a few days. It blinked, mindlessly moving into place and making sure her partner had all of the tools she required before even needing to ask. The petite Ravnut was honestly confused, and the more she tried to figure out what was what, the more questions that just kept popping up in her head. Who's Ichi? Asked, the name unfamiliar to her. Was that a student at a... I don't think I've ever heard of them before. That honestly wasn't that much of a surprise though. Hanjo was nearly notorious for failing to remember the names of anyone she met on a daily basis. Luckily for her, and her close friends however, that unfortunate trait did not extend to those she deeply cared for. The petite Ravnette was incredibly knowledgeable when it came to the people dear to her. Case in point, she knew the name and purpose of every baby her mad partner had made since they'd been stuck together. Speaking of, Mai Hatsune wasn't known for remembering people either, to the point many believed she didn't even remember others existed unless they were either speaking to her that moment or had somehow impressed her. Powerloader himself had once said that between the two, it was a miracle that the girls knew even 5 names total. Both young ladies had taken offense of course, but had been forced to swallow their agitation when their sensei was proven correct 3 fruitless hours later. Ichi. You know, the guy who gave me the schematics for the non-lethal guns? Mai replied, slouching back to get room to judge her work on the wheelchair. The seat could use some extra padding still. Could only stand there, watching the pinkette while her mind struggled to figure out just who her partner was talking about. When the answer didn't magically pop into her head, the petite Ravnette sighed and tapped the frames of her smart glasses. Instantly, the activated invention hummed to life, and an augmented reality screen folded into existence before her. The display was formatted just like her favorite games, more for her ease of use than any programming limitation, and navigating to her stored quest logs took no time at all. Opening the sub-menu in question, saw that there was quite a bit of data to shift through. As it turned out, a character from the infamous Class 1A had given the blueprints for the guns to them, one Izuku Midoriya. Looking through the class roster, no one named Ichi appeared. Huffing at the unfairness of the answer not readily presenting itself, could then backstepped so she could check on Mai's status. If the pinkette was suffering from fatigue or confusion or some other ailment, maybe she'd just made up this Ichi person. To the petite Ravnette's surprise, her partner had quite a number of interactions logged with this Midoriya character. What really shocked her though, was that all of them were marked as positive, successful, even helpful. A few were even listed as having involved physical contact. Blushing, and cursing that she hadn't thought to make mission stats more detailed, dismissed the HUD and returned her focus to her partner, who'd once again gone back to tinkering with the wheelchair. Why you really want this guy to be as comfortable as possible, huh? Questioned innocently. Seeing the resolute nod from the pinkette, she pressed further. Does that mean you like him? For Mai, the world stuttered to a stop like a baby about to malfunction and explode. The pinkette had never given the notions of romance or love much thought. The ideas were dumb, troubling, and ultimately useless when making her babies. They were nothing but distractions that would set her work back and stand as detriments to her focus. Over the years, she'd thought up thousands of denials, a veritable litany of reasons why she'd never actively look for romance, for moments like this when she'd be questioned. To tell the truth, Mai had just been waiting for the day her parents had cared enough to bring a guy home for her to marry. She'd accepted that inevitability, seeing as how for most of her life not a single unremarkable had ever stood out enough to cause her pulse to beat anywhere close to how her babies did. And still, even so, now. Nonsense. Mai erupted, jumping to her feet. She put her fists on her hips and thrust her chest out rebelliously. I'd sooner create my own sex bot than waste my time falling in love with anyone. Grimaced, completely unappreciative of her partner's overzealous nature, while she could, of course, get behind the pinkette's denial for the sake of her dreams. Mai's perchance for bluntness was oftentimes too much for her to deal with. The mental image of a robot named Fisto, and the ease of programming such a creation, were also things the petite Ravnette refused to dwell on. Besides, Mai continued, having returned to attend to the wheelchair, he's already taken, started from the offhand admittance, and the dejection coloring her partner's tone. So it was denial after all. Time skip, there was no way to deny it, things had changed, for the both of them, and knew it. When she'd first been introduced and assigned to Mai, all of the Mad Demon's precious babies had been crazy and unwieldy, not to mention liable to explode at any moment. Now, most Of the time at least, the babies her partner created were sensible and followed a healthy dose of logic in their designs and applications. And it was all thanks to Class 1A's Izuku Midoriya. Making babies for Ichi HMM. Making babies for Ichi. Mai was actually singing in a cheerfully low voice, much to the amusement of her partner, while working on her latest project. If that wasn't proof enough to that the pinkhead was crushing on the Verde net, she didn't know what was. She still didn't quite know why her partner was so interested though. Kid had met Midoriya-san in passing a couple of times by now, either when the heroine training was coming or going from the development studio, and every time the petite Ravna couldn't help but feel shivers run down her spine at the sight of him. Don't get her wrong. The Verdana was absolutely a cutie, and she'd love to hug the stuffing out of him, but when she got close to him, the air itself just turned sinister. So what are you making this time? Asked, turning away from her computer. She was totally not playing a random archaic RPG while waiting for a diagnostics report. More gadgets for Yurichi? The petite Ravnet was, in no way mocking her partner. Kid was 100% supportive of her partner being happy as long as it led to her working on sensible and useful projects. It helped out her own stress levels beyond belief. Still, she liked to push some of the mad demon's buttons from time to time. Hey! Only I get to call him that. Mai protested, turning to whine at her partner for her teasing. Then, before she could even complete the action, the pinkette's face and mood shifted back to utter giddy happiness. But yeah, I'm working on something special for him this time. With that, Mai stepped away from her work table and revealed a number of face masks. The most imposing of these was one forged from iron that had a face mimicking a serious expression with no other noteworthy features. The other masks all resembled skulls, their ghastly visages intimidating in their own ways. There was no doubt in Kid's mind which one was meant to be used by Midoriya-san. Don't you think Midoriya-san is scary enough already? The petite Ravnet questioned, nodding toward the iron mask. Does he really need all the doom and gloom too? Immediately, Kid was answered by a chop to the head, courtesy of a scowling Mai. Don't call him that, the pinkhead huffed, visibly annoyed. Her partner was lucky she knew her words weren't meant as harshly as a lot of other people's. Anyway, I need your help with some final touches. Instantly the petite Ravnet felt the need to nurse a throbbing in her head. She really hated pain, or even the chance of feeling it. But she really couldn't say no to her partner. If she had to suffer a little bit so Mai could be happy, then she'd suck it up. And add an extra hour to her gaming time when she was done with school for the day. Mai, you know I can only do programming, Kid whined, knowing full well her partner did indeed remember. Her engineering skills were too mediocre for the mad demon to ever trust her with physically getting involved with any of her babies. If you want a proving test you'll have to ask Midoriya-san if Saki-san is free to come down. If there was one facet of Midoriya-san's presence that Kid would never like, it would have had to have been laid squarely on the presence of the delinquent of a zombie that was his newest partner. The blonde Spitfire was loud, rowdy, and prone to testing Tank's limitations at the drop of a hat. Actually, I need you to whip up a voice modulation program for the masks, Chan, Mai corrected, giving her partner a clear look of expectation. The skullcaps will just need to cover grunts and non-communicative noise. The iron mask. I need you to change that one to something special. While the HUD from Kid Smart Glasses marked the request as another example of Mai's attraction to their Verdanet schoolmate, the pinkette revealed a box full of ancient VHS tapes. The relics of the past era were positively ancient, though still in good condition all things considered. Reaching in, the mad demon picked up one specific case, artfully showcasing on its cover the odyssey of mystic galactic warriors wielding blades of pure energy. And in the center, stood imposing above all others, was a helmeted villain all in black, a red energy blade in hand. Squealed, and didn't care who heard her. Already she knew she'd be watching the ancient film multiple times over the next few days. She'd have to get the voice just right. It totally wasn't because she really really loved the movie, or its special effects. It was all for science. And if it helped her partner impress the boy she refused to acknowledge her feelings for, well, maybe then that boy would look at the pink head in a more favorable way. Make family call. Hitoshi Shinso, hero course hopeful, sighed as he sat back in his seat, tired beyond his normal insomnia-induced fatigue and still aching all over. His participation in the sports festival might have been over, but at least it had ended with a bang. Holy shit, man. I can't believe you stood up to that monster like that. Dude. I'm so glad I wasn't the one who had to face off against that walking nightmare. Shinso-san. You're a lot tougher than you look, aren't you? While being accepted and praised was a pleasant change for the brainwashing user, the Violet loathed that it had come at the price of Midoriya being continually ostracized and demonized. Unfortunately, due to the tournament's protocols, the other team should have been separated from all others by now and they'd be unable to meet again until later. It was a shame, because Shinso very much wanted to approach the so-called monster and ask for forgiveness. Yeah, sure, if you say so. A thrashing is what I got no matter how you look at it, Hitoshi replied to his classmate's words, deciding to downplay himself. As always, he preferred to keep as above all of the troublesome hassles his classmates created as possible. Now, if you all don't mind, I'm going to go give home a call. Can't have the folks thinking I ended up zombie food now, can I? As usual, the Violet's classmates good-naturedly chuckled and laughed at his dry humor. Of course, if anyone were going to face down a barely controlled ravenous zombie and come out well enough to joke about it, it'd be their very own Shinso-san. After a rough few weeks at the start of the semester, not at all helped by misconceptions and baseless fears, at least half of Class 1C had grown to accept the chronically tired classmate. Or at least stopped pointing fingers at him for his dark work. The other half, still wary of him, was mostly filled by the class's female members, who avoided interacting with him unless in a group. It was a pain, but Shinso wasn't going to try to fight herd mentality in a class he wasn't planning on staying in any longer than he needed to. This is such a pain, Hitoshi murmured as he walked off, the slight twitch of one corner of his mouth the only indication of how he really felt about dialing home. Let's just hope no one else got into any trouble while I was away. As the Violet slipped out his phone and began to dial, he glanced around to make sure no one well-meaning classmate had followed him. If anyone in Class 1C were to see the number he had put into his phone, and understood the meaning of that number, then Hitoshi knew without a doubt they would have raised hell right then and there. Call him secretive, but it was just one of the things he zealously kept to himself, and for good reason. After all, Hitoshi didn't want his family to suffer any more than they already did. And that because, unlike anyone else he knew, the place he called home. Welcome, you have contacted the garden, where your perfect date awaits. Was not the sort of place a student of an illustrious place such as UA would have been expected, or accepted, to be living in. Hitoshi put forth the effort to roll his eyes. Why did she have to do this to him? It wasn't like he didn't know the main phone had caller recognition, he knew there was no way she didn't know it was him. So what was with the attempt at being seductive? 6 out of 10 this time, but I'm glad to hear you're in better spirits, Sarada-chan, Hitoshi deadpanned. The Violet immediately slid into a more serious tone. Especially after what the little forker tried to do to you. You're such a worrywart, Toshine. Sarada's voice carried through the phone line with crystal clear quality, allowing Hitoshi to easily tell his attention was actually appreciated. Always looking after little ol' me. And all of our sisters, how come no one snatched you up yet? Maybe it's because little Tashi is about as lovable as a cactus, Riley remarked the second voice from the phone before Hitoshi could answer. The Violet's eye twitched, realizing his call must have been on speaker and the entirety of his family was probably listening in. Great. Minane, why do you have to say things like that? Hitoshi whined, voice once again, deadpan. It hurts almost as much being stabbed by one of your energy weapons. At least the confirmed presence of the stern, Violet-eyed Ravnet meant that Mama Yu had decided on who'd be guarding Sarada-chan while she got over the last remnants of that perverted midget's attack. And really, who better than one of their older sisters who was also currently one of the garden's best enforcers? No, one messed with Mina Hazuki and got away with it without paying a hefty price. Children, cut in a third voice. This one deeper and effortlessly sultrier than Sarada-chan could have ever hoped to achieve at her age. Hitoshi almost gulped. Even having guessed that the rest of the family was probably listening in. Somehow having proof that even Mama Yu's second-in-command was present still surprised him. I'm sure that we have better uses for Tashi-chan's time. You can flirt when he gets back, but for now, Tashi-chan, how are you faring? Ignoring the sputtering and giggling that erupted on the other side of the phone, Hitoshi subconsciously straightened as he gathered his thoughts. If you didn't mess with Minane, then you definitely never, ever even tried to get on this woman's bad side, even by accident. I was just calling to check in and let you all know I survived, Hitoshi said, mostly joking. There were a few chuckles heard over the phone, but also a fair number of grumpy harumphs. He was going to have to make so much mochi to make up for his stubbornness, wasn't he? Oh well. There's no need to worry about me and T-Harable. Yeah, we saw your match. We're watching the festival in the family room, you know. Sarada cut back in, easily phasing back into the conversation with a warm tinge to her voice. Should I go get Mama Yu? She's kinda on a date with Naoji at the moment, but I'm sure she'd be willing to take a few minutes to make sure you're okay. Hitoshi was already shaking his head, even though he knew the others couldn't see him do it. He'd hate to take Mama Yu from one of her special dates with Naoji. The two were so in love it was nauseating, and being apart visibly affected them to those who knew how to look, but they just refused to officially tie the knot. It had made the Violette and more than a few of his sisters, older and younger both, almost pull out their hair in frustration. No need for that, Hitoshi eventually answered verbally, just pass on my message. More importantly, how are you feeling? Want me to get you something on my way home later? The escorts at the garden knew that they routinely faced possible danger when going out on their dates. It was an accepted part of the job. The men, and sometimes women, who hired them always went through background checks before being given approval, but, even then, there was always a chance a client might be willing to push their luck. Recently, Sarada-chan had entered herself into the pot for their age group, and immediately misfortune had struck. The bespectacled young teen had had the bad luck of being hired out by a midget with some ridiculous quirk involving balls of all things. The loser had ended up expecting far more than the garden offered, and hadn't been willing to take no for an answer. Hitoshi still kicked himself for being unavailable to subtly keep track of Sarada-chan while she'd been on her date, like he had with many other of his younger and slightly older sisters. What use was he as an enforcer if he wasn't there to enforce policy when he was needed? It ate at his soul. What could have happened to his little sister? Luckily, the detective had been on his way to visit Mama Yu at the very moment the midget had lost his mind and attacked, sparing Sarada-chan from the worst of fates. Well, since you're offering, why don't you take me on a date? The bespectacled girl giggled as laughter of all kinds crashed through the phone, their sister's humor almost overpowering Hitoshi's own grumbling. I keep telling you, women are better, Sarada-chan. Hazuki's own grumbling could be heard faintly by the Violette, causing him to scoff. You're just wasting your time on men, even if Tashi-chan is the best of them. Hitoshi quirked a brow at that. Due to the circumstances that had brought many of his aunties and sisters, both younger and older, to the garden, it had been no surprise to the Violette when he learned at a young age that many in his family preferred relations with their own sex instead of his own. He honestly couldn't blame them. Some of the stories he'd heard growing up. Still, a backward compliment from a lesbian had to mean something right, especially if they were family. That didn't mean he wouldn't strike back, however. I don't think your quirk quite agrees with you, Minane, Hitoshi said with a smirk, poking fun at the absolutely hilarious activation requirement for his older sister's quirk. Who is it that had to quiet you? Hazuki roared, the volume of the Ravnet's voice making it clear she'd either picked up the phone or had shoved her face as close as possible to the device on Sarada-chan's end. So much for the enforcer's cold and stoic demeanor, though at least Hitoshi knew he still had that get-under-your-skin talent of his. Don't think you're too old for and now, no need for threats here. A fourth voice stepped in, one that caused Hitoshi's eyes to widen in surprise. Big Sis Seiki? What are you doing back home? The Violet asked, shock raising his voice above its natural deadpan for once. Growing up in a place like the garden, Hitoshi had had many sisters and aunts come and go from the establishment over the years. Mama Yu had made it a point that anyone who came needing help could stay as long as they needed, and were free to stay or leave even when their troubles were over. Some of his family would never be able to leave the garden though, through no fault of their own. Others preferred the close-knit sisterhood environment Mama Yu had cultivated. Him being the only exception outside Naoji, and stayed for the family they'd found. Those that chose to leave, for whatever reason, whether it was because their lives had settled down, or they'd found someone to settle down with, were always welcome to come visit, although it always seemed like a surprise when they dropped by. Like now. No one asked you, traitor, Hazuki bit out, clearly sullen at the older woman's presence. Oh, get over yourself, Mina, came the quick response, just as clearly done with the Ravnet's attitude. Just because I fell in love with a man and got married does not make me a traitor. It does when you swore, girls. The single word, spoken by Andy Harible's deep voice, silenced all noise from the other side of the phone. Even Hitoshi found himself tensing at the command the older woman seemed to demand so easily. We all know how you feel, Mina, the second in command of the garden said, laying down the law. But we all vetted Takahashi-san separately back when he first began courting Seiki, and he miraculously passed all inspections. The matter is closed. In the following silence, not a soul was brave enough to even breathe loud enough for Hitoshi to hear, from his side of the phone. The Violet shook his head in exasperation at how the situation had almost fallen apart within seconds. Gotta love family. I was just kidding, Tashi, Sarada hesitantly said, finally breaking the silence. The younger girl was obviously fighting her unease at being the first one to speak after Andy Harible had put her foot down. Just come home safe, okay, love, bye. With that, the phone call abruptly ended, leaving the perpetually tired teen smiling warmly. Love you too. Hitoshi did the call, he'd never know. Maybe it was a big brother thing? Oh well. Crash. Thump thump thump. Not even bothering to turn his head, Hitoshi could tell a few of his classmates had decided to spy on him and had collapsed after hearing how he finished his phone call to who they had every reason to believe was his family by blood. Well then, looked like it might be time for a little quirk use. Slipping his phone back into his pocket, Hitoshi turned to look at the group of exposed spies. The four idiots who'd pressed their luck and failed their saving throws all flinched at his flat glare. Oh yeah, it was definitely time for some brainwashing. For his family.